The first light of dawn cracked across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Sarah Blackwood stood on her cabin porch, rifle gripped in trembling hands, watching as the shadows on the distant ridge took form. 80 Cheyenne. Warriors materialized from the morning mist, their faces marked with ochre and black paint, feathers and bone talismans catching the first rays of sunlight. At their center rode a figure draped in a cloak of eagle feathers and wolf fur, his gaze fixed directly on her small homestead. The warriors halted in perfect unison when he raised his hand. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's throat tightened as she glanced behind her. Through the cabin window, she could see the small boy, the child she had saved, watching with eyes that held both fear and recognition. His hand pressed against the glass, leaving a small, foggy imprint. When she turned back, the leader had dismounted, his feet connecting with the earth without a sound. His eyes, dark as river stones, locked with hers across the distance. The decision. Dust had become Sarah's constant companion. It collected in the folds of her faded cotton dresses, settled into the creases of her palms, and coated the pages of the few books she kept neatly stacked on her bedside table. After 2 years on this harsh frontier land, she had learned that the dust was more reliable than people. Her homestead sat 3 miles east of Riverton, a town that had reluctantly sprouted along the banks of the Missouri River sometime in the 1850s. Most days, Sarah was grateful for those 3 miles of separation. The distance was close enough to haul supplies when necessary, but far enough to keep the whispers and stares from following her home. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy, one main room with a small bedroom partitioned off the back, a stone hearth that warmed the space through bitter winters, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. A crooked fence enclosed her small garden plot, where carrots, potatoes, and beans struggled against the unpredictable weather. Beyond the fence stretched the endless prairie, golden grasses bending under constant wind, punctuated by occasional stands of cottonwood trees that marked the presence of water. As she hung laundry on the line that morning, Sarah paused to rub her right knee. The old injury always complained when rain was coming. Overhead, clouds were gathering in the west, dark and heavy with promise. She estimated she had perhaps 2 hours before the storm arrived. At 32, Sarah carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had survived more than her share of hardship. Her chestnut hair, once long and lustrous, was now kept in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. The scar that ran from her right temple down to her jaw pulled slightly at her smile, a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything. 4 years ago, she had been Sarah Mitchell, wife to David and mother to 5-year-old Rebecca. Their farm in Kansas had been modest but thriving, with dreams of expansion and prosperity driving their days. Then came the raid. Whether it was jayhawkers or bushwhackers hardly mattered in the end. The flames had claimed both her family and her former self, leaving behind only ash, grief, and the disfigured woman who now carried her name. The townsfolk of Riverton hardly knew what to make of Sarah Blackwood, the surname she had taken after dragging herself from the ashes of her former life. A woman alone, claiming homestead rights, building fences and hunting for her own meat, was unusual enough. The scar that twisted her once pretty face into something unsettling only added to their discomfort. Pastor Williams nodded politely when she attended Sunday services, but she was never invited to join the church socials afterward. The general store owner, Mr. Hammond, took her money quickly and offered little conversation. The children whispered "witch" when she passed by, thinking she couldn't hear them. Only Dr. Bennett treated her with true kindness, occasionally bringing excess, medical supplies or seeds for her garden. But even he seemed relieved when their interactions concluded, as though her misfortune might somehow be contagious. "You can't blame them for their fear," Dr. Bennett had told her once. "Most folks prefer simple stories. Good and evil, right? And wrong. You're a chapter they don't know how to read." Sarah had simply nodded, understanding all too well. She had become accustomed to solitude, even found comfort in it. The land didn't judge her scarred face or question her right to survive. It simply demanded respect and hard work, both of which she could provide. Last autumn, Sarah had started selling extra vegetables and occasionally furs in town. The money wasn't much, but it allowed her to purchase ammunition, coffee, and the rare luxury of sugar or new fabric. Her interactions remained brief, her eyes often focused on the ground rather than meeting the uncomfortable gazes of the townsfolk. Mrs. Patterson, the mayor's wife, had once loudly observed that the Blackwood woman has the manner of someone haunted. Sarah had wanted to tell her that haunting implied ghosts, and ghosts implied death. What lived inside her wasn't dead. It was rage, carefully banked like coals beneath ash, waiting for the right moment to ignite. The laundry secured on the line, Sarah returned to the cabin to continue her morning routine. The single window faced east, allowing morning light to warm the small space. She had built most of the furniture herself, a rough table with 2 chairs, shelves for her meager belongings, a rocking chair positioned near the hearth. The walls were adorned with a few treasures, a small mirror, a hunting knife mounted on a polished board, and a child's drawing in charcoal of 3 stick figures holding hands. Every morning, Sarah allowed herself exactly 1 minute to look at that drawing before turning away. Any longer risked cracking the careful walls she had built around her grief. The day proceeded like countless others before it. She tended the garden, checked her snares in the nearby woods, mended a loose floorboard on the porch. The physical labor kept her mind quiet, her body too exhausted for nightmares. By late afternoon, the promised storm had arrived, driving her indoors with its fury. Rain lashed against the windows as thunder shook the small cabin. Sarah stirred a pot of stew over the fire, listening to the rhythm of water striking the roof. These were the moments when the silence of her existence felt most profound, the contrast between the storm's rage outside and the emptiness within her walls. When the first thump came against her door, she assumed it was a branch torn loose by the wind. The second thump, followed by a low moan, sent her reaching for the rifle that hung above the hearth. Sarah approached cautiously, weapon raised, and listened. Another sound came, not a thump this time, but a whimper, small and pained. Curiosity overcame caution. She cracked the door open, peering into the torrent. At first, she saw nothing but the curtain of rain. Then a movement at her feet drew her gaze downward. A child lay crumpled on her porch, drenched and shivering. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, his small body curled against the driving rain. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see that his clothing was not that of a settler's child. He wore buckskin leggings, now soaked through, and a deerskin shirt adorned with beadwork. His black hair hung in wet ropes around a face contorted in pain. Cheyenne. The realization should have caused her to step back to close the door. Relations between settlers and the native tribes had deteriorated rapidly in recent months. Rumors of attacks on outlying homesteads circulated through town like wildfire, each retelling growing more terrifying than the last. The army had established a fort 30 miles west, supposedly for protection, though most knew it was to monitor tribal movements as more white settlers pushed into traditional hunting grounds. But Sarah didn't close the door. Instead, she looked closer and saw what had caused the boy to collapse on her doorstep. His right leg was wrapped in a crude bandage, now saturated with blood and mud. The wound was fresh, the child obviously in agony. For one suspended moment, Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, the rifle still clutched in her hands. The logical choice, the safe choice, would be to leave him, perhaps alert the army patrol that occasionally passed by her property. A Cheyenne child this far from his. People meant trouble, the kind that could get a lone woman killed. But as she looked at his small form, another image superimposed itself. Her daughter Rebecca, her body too still among the burning timbers of their Kansas home. The memory made her decision for her. Sarah set the rifle aside and knelt beside the boy. He flinched when she touched his shoulder, dark eyes flying open in terror. He tried to crawl away, but the movement sent a spasm of pain through him, and he collapsed with a cry. "It's all right," Sarah said softly, though she knew he couldn't understand her words. "I won't hurt you." He watched her with wary eyes as she slowly extended her hand, palm up in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. After a long moment, he stopped trying to escape, whether from exhaustion or acceptance she couldn't tell. With slow, deliberate movements, Sarah lifted the child into her arms. He was painfully light, his body burning with fever beneath the cold. Wet clothes. He made no sound as she carried him inside, but his eyes darted around the cabin, taking in every detail as if memorizing escape routes. She laid him on her bed and returned to bolt the door against the storm. When she turned back, she found him trying to sit up, his face pale with effort. "No," she said firmly, gently pressing him back onto the mattress. "You need to rest." The boy said something in his own language, a stream of words that meant nothing to her. Sarah shook her head and pointed to his injured leg. "I need to look at that." Gathering clean cloths, her small medical kit, and a basin of heated water, Sarah returned to the bedside. The boy watched her every move, tension evident in his small frame. Slowly, she reached for the crude bandage on his leg. He grabbed her wrist, surprising her with his strength despite his condition. They stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. Sarah knew that trust would not come easily, not from a Cheyenne child to a white woman. Carefully she pulled away and removed the bandage from her own leg, exposing the twisted scar tissue from an old burn that covered her calf. The boy's eyes widened slightly. "We all have our wounds," she said quietly. The child released her wrist, allowing her to turn her attention to his injury. When she unwrapped the soiled bandage, Sarah had to steel herself against the sight. A deep gash ran along his calf, the edges inflamed and angry. Without treatment, infection would claim him within days. Working methodically, she cleaned the wound, applied a poultice of herbs Dr. Bennett had taught her to use, and wrapped it in clean bandaging. Throughout the process, the boy remained stoically silent, though she could feel him trembling beneath her hands. When she finished, Sarah offered him a cup of water, which he accepted after a moment's hesitation. His eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that felt older than his years. She wondered what circumstances had led him to her doorstep, alone and injured in a storm. Cheyenne children were carefully watched, valued members of their community. For this boy to be separated from his people meant something had gone terribly wrong. Night fell fully as the storm continued to rage. Sarah made a pallet for herself near the hearth, allowing the boy to keep the bed. She knew sleep would elude her. The presence of the child had upset the careful balance of her isolation. Tomorrow would bring difficult decisions. The army would consider her harboring an Indian, regardless of his age, and the townsfolk would be quick to condemn her if they discovered her actions. Yet, as she watched the boy finally succumb to exhaustion, his small chest rising and falling in the flickering firelight, Sarah felt something stir within her that she had thought long dead. A fierce protectiveness, a determination that no more harm would come to this child if she could prevent it. Outside, the storm gradually subsided. leaving behind a hushed stillness broken only by the occasional drip of water from the eaves. Sarah stoked the fire one last time before settling onto her makeshift bed. "What am I going to do with you?" she whispered to the sleeping child. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that her decision to shelter one lost Cheyenne boy would soon bring 80 warriors to her doorstep at dawn. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the cabin windows. Sarah woke instantly, years of solitude having sharpened her senses to any change in her environment. She looked immediately to the bed, half expecting to find it empty, the boy having fled during the night. But he was still there, propped up against the wall, watching her with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. The fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving his face less flushed, but still drawn with pain. "Good morning," Sarah said, rising from her pallet. "Are you hungry?" The boy didn't respond verbally, but his gaze followed her as she moved to the hearth to stir the banked coals back to life. She prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of her honey, placing a bowl within his reach. After a moment's hesitation, hunger won out over suspicion, and he began to eat. Sarah sat at the table with her own portion, giving him space while considering her options. The boy needed medical attention beyond what she could provide, but taking him to Dr. Bennett meant exposing his presence to the town. The nearest Cheyenne encampment was at least 2 days' ride to the northwest, and she couldn't be certain they were even his people. Different bands moved throughout the territory, some more hostile to settlers than others. As she pondered these problems, the boy spoke, his voice stronger than she'd expected. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Maheo!" Sarah looked up, startled. "What did you say?" He touched his chest. "Maheo." Then he pointed at her, his expression questioning. "Sarah," she replied, realizing he was telling her his name. "I'm Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated carefully, the syllables awkward on his tongue. It was a small moment of connection, but significant. Names were powerful things on the frontier, often the only possession that couldn't be stolen. By sharing his, the boy had offered a fragile thread of trust. After breakfast, Sarah checked his wound again. The herbs seemed to be helping. The angry red streaks that had begun to spread from the gash were receding. Still, he would need time to heal before he could walk any distance. Sarah decided to risk a quick trip to her barn, a small structure that housed her mule and a few chickens. The boy watched her prepare to leave with obvious anxiety. "I'll be right back," she assured him, pointing outside and then making a returning gesture. Whether he understood or not, he made no move to follow as she stepped out into the moisture-heavy morning air. The world had been washed clean by the storm, droplets clinging to every blade of grass and leaf. In the distance, Sarah could see the Missouri River had risen, its normally placid surface churned into muddy turmoil. She hurried to the barn, gathering eggs and checking on her animals before returning to the cabin. When she pushed open the door, she found Maheo examining the knife she kept mounted on the wall. He didn't appear startled by her return, merely glanced at her before returning the weapon to its place with careful precision. "That belonged to my husband," Sarah said, though she knew he couldn't understand. Speaking the words aloud felt strange after so many months of silence. He called it his lucky knife. Didn't do him much good in the end. Throughout the day, they established a cautious routine. Sarah tended to her chores while Maheo rested, his eyes following her movements. Occasionally, he would point to an object, and she would provide the English word. He absorbed each new term with remarkable quickness, repeating it until his pronunciation satisfied him. By evening, he had accumulated a small vocabulary: water, fire, bread, knife, chair, blanket, simple. Words that bridged the vast gulf between their worlds. Sarah found herself talking more than she had in years, explaining each task as she performed it, knowing that while he might not grasp her meaning, the sound of a human voice seemed to comfort him. As night fell once more, she noticed him gazing at the child's drawing on the wall. "That was Rebecca's," Sarah said softly. "My daughter. She was younger than you when she drew it." Maheo looked at her questioningly. Sarah touched her chest, then pointed to the smallest stick figure. "Rebecca." She then pointed to the other figures. "David. Sarah." Finally, she made a sweeping gesture with her hand, then clasped them together and pulled them apart explosively. Gone. The boy's expression changed, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. He pointed to himself, then made a similar gesture of separation. "You're lost too, aren't you?" Sarah asked. "Separated. From your people?" Maheo pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, his gaze drifting to the window where darkness had settled completely. In that moment, he looked impossibly young and vulnerable, a child caught between worlds not of his making. Sarah allowed him to keep the bed again, and as she settled onto her pallet by the hearth, she realized that for the first time in years, her small cabin didn't feel empty. The quiet breathing of another person filled the space, reminding her that somewhere beneath the scar tissue and calluses that had grown around her heart, something vital still remained. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that far to the northwest, a Cheyenne war chief named Black Kettle was gathering warriors to find his missing son, and that in 6 more days their paths would converge at her doorstep in a moment that would redefine everything she thought she knew about courage, redemption, and belonging. The first rays of morning light slipped through the cabin window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Sarah had been awake for hours, her sleep disturbed by unfamiliar sounds, the soft breathing of another person, the occasional rustling of blankets as Maheo shifted in his sleep. It had been years since she'd shared her space with anyone, and the presence of the boy made her small cabin feel both crowded and strangely alive. She rolled from her pallet by the hearth and began her morning routine, moving quietly to avoid waking her young guest. As she stoked the fire and set water to boil, she glanced frequently at the sleeping child. His color had improved overnight, and his breathing seemed easier. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought her movements to an abrupt halt. Visitors were rare enough to be a concern on any day. With a Cheyenne child under her roof, they represented a potential threat. Sarah quickly moved to the window, peering cautiously through the grime-streaked glass. A solitary rider approached her cabin, the morning sun at his back, making it difficult to identify him immediately. As he drew closer, Sarah recognized the broad-shouldered figure of James Cooper, the town's blacksmith. Like her, Cooper kept largely to himself, though for different reasons. Rumors about his past circulated through Riverton, that he'd fought for the Union and returned too damaged for proper society, or that he'd killed a man in St. Louis before fleeing west. Sarah had never put much stock in town gossip, having been its target often enough herself. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Maheo, who had woken and was watching her with alert eyes. She gestured for him to remain in the bed, then pulled a quilt over him for good measure. "I'll be right back." Grabbing her rifle from its place by the door, not to threaten but to remind any visitor that she was capable of defending herself, Sarah stepped onto the porch just as Cooper reined his horse to a stop at her gate. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," Cooper called, removing his hat. His voice was deep but surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. A ragged scar ran from his left ear down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, a badge of some untold violence. In his past, Mr. Cooper, Sarah acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you out this way?" "Storm brought down some trees across the main road," he explained. "Was checking the outlying properties to make sure everyone weathered it all right." Sarah doubted this was his only reason for riding out to her homestead. Cooper's forge kept him busy from dawn till dusk most days. "We're fine here, just some branches down, nothing serious." Cooper nodded, his eyes scanning the property with the careful assessment of a man accustomed to looking for trouble before it found him. "Army patrol came through town yesterday," he said, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "Said there was a Cheyenne movement north of here, a hunting party separated from the main band during the storm." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her heart began to pound harder against her ribs. "Is that so? They're looking for something, or someone," Cooper continued. "Major Davis has men combing the area between here and the river. Thought you should know." The implication was clear enough. Cooper wasn't simply delivering news, he was warning her. But why? Did he suspect she was harboring the boy, or was this a general caution given to all homesteaders in the area? "I appreciate the information," Sarah said carefully. "Haven't seen any sign of trouble myself." Cooper studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if coming to some private decision. "There's talk in town. Mrs. Patterson saw smoke from your chimney last night, said it was burning hotter than a widow living alone would need." Sarah's grip tightened on her rifle. Patricia Patterson was the postmaster's wife, a woman whose primary occupation seemed to be cataloguing the business of others. "Wood was damp from the storm," Sarah replied. "Had to burn more to dry out the cabin." "That's what I figured," Cooper said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Just thought you should know people are talking." "People are always talking, Mr. Cooper. Doesn't concern me much with what they say." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "No, I don't suppose it does." He settled his hat back on his head and gathered his reins. "Well, if you need anything from town, I'll be making a supply run at week's end." It was an offer of assistance, unexpected, but not unwelcome. Sarah had been running low on several essentials, and with Maheo to consider, the idea of leaving the cabin for even a few hours was problematic. "I might take you up on that," she said, her tone softening slightly. "Thank you." Cooper nodded, then hesitated. "Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah," he said, using her given name for the first time in their acquaintance. "Whatever you're doing, be careful. These are dangerous times for folks who don't fit neatly into one camp or another." Before she could respond, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Sarah standing on the porch with the distinct impression that James Cooper knew more than he was letting on, and that his warning carried more significance than a simple neighborly gesture. When she returned inside, Maheo had pushed the quilt aside and was sitting upright, his dark eyes fixed on the door as if expecting soldiers to burst through at any moment. "It's all right," Sarah assured him, setting her rifle aside. "He's gone." The boy said something. In Cheyenne, his voice urgent. Though she couldn't understand the words, his meaning was clear enough. Concern, perhaps fear. Sarah shook her head. "Friend," she said slowly, pointing in the direction Cooper had ridden. "He won't tell anyone you're here." Whether Maheo understood her meaning or simply trusted her tone, he seemed to relax slightly. Sarah busied herself preparing breakfast, her mind turning over Cooper's warning. If the army was searching for missing Cheyenne, it wouldn't be long before they came to her cabin. She needed to decide what to do with Maheo before then. As they ate, Sarah noticed the boy watching her scar with undisguised curiosity. Most people either stared when they thought she wouldn't notice or studiously avoided looking at the twisted tissue that ran from temple to jaw. Maheo's direct gaze was refreshing in its honesty. "Fire," she explained, touching the scar. "Bad men. Long time ago." Maheo nodded, then touched his own injured leg. "Wasichu," he said, using the term she had heard before, the Lakota and Cheyenne word for white people. Bad men. The simple exchange confirmed what Sarah had suspected. The boy's wound had come from an encounter with white settlers or soldiers. The knowledge settled like a stone in her stomach. Whatever circumstances had brought Maheo to her doorstep, they were unlikely to be resolved peacefully if the army found him here. After breakfast, Sarah helped Maheo to the porch where he could sit in the fresh air while she tended to her morning chores. His leg was healing well, but he still couldn't put much weight on it. She showed him how to snap peas into a wooden bowl, giving him a task to occupy his hands while he watched her work. As the morning passed, Sarah found herself speaking more than she had in months, narrating her activities partly to help Maheo learn more English words, but also because the silence that had once been her companion now felt strangely empty. "The garden needs weeding," she explained, kneeling between rows of vegetables. "These plants we keep, food. These plants we pull, not food." Maheo absorbed each new word with remarkable quickness, repeating them until his pronunciation matched hers. By midday, he was stringing together simple phrases, his natural intelligence bridging the language gap with surprising speed. "Sarah garden," he would say, or "Maheo help soon," pointing to his injured leg with a determined expression that suggested he had no intention of being an idle guest once he could walk properly. The day passed in this manner, a tentative rhythm, establishing itself between them. As Sarah prepared the evening meal, she was struck by how quickly she had adapted to the boy's presence, how natural it felt to set two places at the table instead of one. It was dangerous thinking. Maheo wasn't hers to keep. He belonged to his people, a people currently being hunted by soldiers who would consider Sarah a traitor for harboring him. The rational course of action would be to help him heal enough to travel, then send him on his way, perhaps with Cooper's assistance, if the blacksmith truly meant to help. But as she watched the boy carefully arranging kindling by the hearth, his small face serious with concentration, Sarah knew she couldn't simply turn him out. Whatever had separated him from his people, whatever violence had wounded his leg and driven him to seek refuge with a scarred white woman miles from anywhere, had forged a connection between them that transcended the expected boundaries. They were both survivors, both marked by losses too profound for words. In helping him, Sarah had awakened something she thought long dead, a sense of purpose, of connection to another human being. As twilight settled over the cabin, Sarah lit the lamp and sat in her rocking chair, watching as Maheo explored his surroundings with growing confidence. He moved with careful precision, touching objects with a deliberate gentleness that spoke of respect rather than fear. When he came to the small wooden box Sarah kept on a high shelf, he looked at her questioningly. "Memories," she said, taking down the box and opening it. Inside lay the few treasures she had salvaged from her former life, a wedding band too painful to wear, a lock of Rebecca's hair tied with faded ribbon, a small book of poetry David had read aloud on winter evenings. Maheo peered into the box with solemn interest, understanding without words that these objects held sacred significance. He pointed to the ribbon. "Daughter," Sarah said softly. "Rebecca." The boy touched his own chest, then made a sweeping gesture with his arm before pointing outside. Sarah understood he was telling her something about his own people, his own family. "Father? Mother?" she asked. "Father," Maheo confirmed, his expression brightening slightly. He held his hand high above his head, then made a gesture that mimicked someone riding a horse. "Strong warrior." The simple declaration carried both pride and longing. Wherever Maheo's father was, the boy clearly missed him deeply. Sarah wondered if the man was among those searching for his son, perhaps even part of the hunting party Cooper had mentioned. "We'll find him," she promised, knowing Maheo might not understand her words, but hoping he would grasp her intent. "When your leg is better, we'll find your father." That night, as Maheo slept peacefully in her bed, Sarah sat by the window watching. The moonlit landscape. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, silver-tipped grasses swaying in the night breeze. Somewhere out there, a Cheyenne father was looking for his son. Somewhere out there, army patrols were searching for hostiles. And here, in this small cabin caught between worlds, Sarah Blackwood was making decisions that would either condemn or redeem her. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Sarah was hanging laundry when she spotted 3 riders approaching from the direction of town. Even at a distance, she recognized the rigid posture of Major Davis, commander of the Army detachment stationed near Riverton. Flanking him were 2 soldiers, rifles clearly visible in their saddle holsters. Her heart racing, Sarah hurried back to the cabin. Maheo was sitting at the table, practicing writing letters in the dust she'd deliberately left on the surface for this purpose. His quick mind had taken to written language with the same enthusiasm he showed for spoken words. "Soldiers!" she said urgently, gesturing for him to follow her. "Hide!" Maheo's eyes widened, but he moved without hesitation, grabbing his few possessions and limping toward her as quickly as his injured leg would allow. Sarah led him to the root cellar, a small space beneath a trap door covered by the rug under her table. She helped him down into the darkness, pressing a finger to her lips. "Quiet," she whispered. "I'll come get you when it's safe." The boy nodded, his expression solemn but unafraid. Sarah closed the trapdoor, arranged the rug to hide any trace of disturbance, and had just moved the table back into position when a sharp knock sounded at the door. Smoothing her skirts with trembling hands, Sarah took a deep breath and went. To greet her unwelcome visitors, Major Davis stood on her porch, his uniform immaculate despite the dusty ride, his expression as rigid as his posture. Behind him, the 2 soldiers remained mounted, their eyes scanning the property with professional vigilance. "Mrs. Blackwood," the major said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy that did nothing to soften his severe countenance. "May I have a word?" Sarah stepped aside, allowing him to enter, while keeping the doorway blocked from the view of the men outside. "What brings the army to my doorstep, Major?" Davis glanced around the cabin, his gaze methodical and assessing. "We're conducting a security sweep of the area. There have been reports of Cheyenne activity following the storm." "So I've heard," Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Mr. Cooper mentioned it yesterday." "Did he now?" Davis's eyebrow arched slightly. "And has Mr. Cooper made a habit of visiting your property?" The implication was clear and unwelcome. Sarah squared her shoulders. "Is there something specific you're looking for, Major? I have chores waiting." Davis continued his visual inspection of the cabin, moving further inside despite not being invited to do so. "We believe a small group of Cheyenne separated from their hunting party during the storm. Most concerning is that one of them appears to be a boy, the son of a particularly influential war chief." Sarah's heart stuttered in her chest, but she kept her expression carefully blank. "I don't see what that has to do with me." "Several settlers reported seeing smoke from your chimney during the storm," Davis said, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "More smoke than one might expect from a woman living alone." "The wood was damp," Sarah replied, repeating the explanation she'd given Cooper. "And I don't see how my fire-tending habits are the Army's concern." Davis smiled thinly. "Everything in this territory is the Army's concern, Mrs. Blackwood, especially when it involves the safety of its settlers." He moved toward the table where Maheo had been sitting just minutes before. Sarah fought the urge to glance at the trap door beneath it, forcing herself to maintain eye contact with the Major. "I've lived alone for 2 years without incident," she said firmly. "I've never had trouble with the Cheyenne or any other tribe." "Perhaps not," Davis conceded, running a gloved finger along the tabletop. He paused, examining the dust that came away on the leather. For one terrible moment, Sarah thought he had noticed the crude letters Maheo had been practicing, but the major merely wiped his glove clean and turned back to her. Nevertheless, I would advise you to be vigilant. The situation is delicate. Black Kettle is not a chief to be trifled with, and he's reportedly quite determined to recover his son. The name landed like a stone in Sarah's consciousness. Black Kettle, one of the most powerful and respected Cheyenne chiefs, known for his attempts to maintain peace with white settlers despite provocations from both sides. And Maheo was his son? I'll keep that in mind, Sarah managed, her throat suddenly dry. Davis nodded, apparently satisfied with his inspection. We'll be increasing patrols in this area. If you see anything unusual, any sign of Indians or strangers of any kind, you're to signal immediately. He pointed to the ridge behind her property. 3 rifle shots in succession. We'll have men close enough to hear. I appreciate the Army's concern, Sarah said, the words tasting false on her tongue. As Davis moved toward the door, he paused, his gaze lingering on the child's drawing still pinned to the wall. I wasn't aware you had children, Mrs. Blackwood. I don't, Sarah replied, the familiar pain surfacing despite her efforts to suppress it. Not anymore. Something flickered in the major's eyes, perhaps genuine sympathy, perhaps merely the recognition of useful information. My condolences, he said with a slight nod. Good day, Mrs. Blackwood. Sarah watched from the porch as Davis mounted his horse and conferred briefly with his men before all 3 riders departed down the trail toward town. Only when they were well out of sight did she rush back inside and move the table to access the trap door. Maheo blinked up at her from the darkness of the root cellar, his expression a mixture of relief and anxiety. It's safe now, Sarah assured, helping him climb out. They're gone. As the boys settled back at the table, Sarah paced the small confines of the cabin, her mind racing. The situation had suddenly become far more complicated. Maheo wasn't simply a lost Cheyenne child. He was the son of Black Kettle, a chief whose influence extended far beyond his immediate band. If the army discovered she was harboring him, the consequences would be severe. At best, she would lose her homestead. At worst, she could face charges of treason. Yet looking at Maheo's face, so young, so determined despite his circumstances, Sarah knew she couldn't surrender him to Davis and his men. Whatever had happened to separate the boy from his father, returning him to army custody would only ensure he became a pawn in the ongoing conflict between settlers and the native tribes. Black Kettle, she said, watching Maheo's reaction carefully. Your father. The boy's eyes widened and he nodded vigorously. Mahotsi, he confirmed, using the Cheyenne name before switching to the term whites had given his father. Black Kettle. Sarah knelt beside him, meeting his gaze directly. The soldiers are looking for you. They want to find you before your father does. Maheo's expression darkened. Though he might not understand every word, he clearly grasped the essence of their situation. He pointed to his injured leg, then mimicked riding a horse. Not yet, Sarah said, shaking her head. Your leg needs more time to heal, and even then, I don't know how to get you safely back to your people. As she spoke the words, a solution began to form in her mind. Or rather, a potential ally. James Cooper had warned her about the Army's search. He had offered to make a supply run at week's end, and something in his manner had suggested he was no friend to Major Davis and his men. It was a risk, trusting anyone with Maheo's presence, but Sarah was quickly running out of options. If Cooper truly wanted to help, he might know of safe routes to the Cheyenne encampments, ways to avoid Army patrols. For now, though, their immediate concern was keeping Maheo hidden. The increased patrols Davis had promised meant more eyes watching her homestead, more chances for discovery. We need to be more careful, Sarah told the boy, pointing first to his makeshift writing surface. "No more marks where others can see. And we need a better hiding place than the root cellar." Together, they spent the afternoon preparing. Sarah showed Maheo how to recognize the sound of approaching horses, how to distinguish between the regular rhythm of army patrols and the less disciplined approach of civilian riders. They established signals. 2 soft knocks meant danger, 3 meant all clear. Behind the cabin, partially concealed by a stand of cottonwoods, Sarah uncovered a small dugout she had created during her first winter on the homestead, a shelter, where she had planned to store extra provisions against the harsh prairie winters. It had never been fully completed, but it offered a more spacious hiding place than the root cellar, with a narrow tunnel connecting it to the main cabin. "If soldiers come again," she explained, leading Maheo through the passage, "you hide here, not under the floor." The boy explored the space with interest, seeming to approve of its defensive qualities. He pointed to a small air shaft that led to the surface, camouflaged among rocks and prairie grass. "Watch here," he said in his improving English. "See who comes." Sarah nodded, impressed by his strategic thinking. "Yes, good idea." As they emerged from the dugout into the fading afternoon light, Sarah was struck by how quickly their situation had evolved. 3 days ago she had been alone, her life defined by routine and solitude. Now she was harboring the son of a Cheyenne chief, deceiving army officers, and contemplating an alliance with the enigmatic blacksmith, all to protect a child she barely knew but had somehow become responsible for. The weight of these choices should have terrified her. Instead, Sarah felt more alive than she had in years. For the first time since the fire that had claimed her family, she was acting rather than merely surviving, making decisions that mattered beyond the boundaries of her small existence. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Sarah noticed Maheo watching her with an expression that seemed older than his years, a mixture of gratitude and concern that suggested he understood the risks she was taking on his behalf. "Thank you, Sarah," he said carefully, the words clearly practiced while she had been occupied with other tasks. The simple phrase, delivered with such earnest dignity, caught her off guard. Sarah knelt beside him, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "You're welcome, Maheo," she replied softly. "We'll find a way to get you home, I promise." What neither of them could know was that 4 days later, that promise would be tested in ways Sarah could never have imagined. When 80 Cheyenne warriors materialized from the dawn mist, led by a father determined to reclaim his son. The 4th day dawned gray and heavy with unshed rain. Sarah woke to the sound of distant thunder rolling across the prairie, a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards beneath her pallet. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb Maheo, who still slept in her bed, his small form barely creating a ripple beneath the quilt. For 3 days, they had settled into a cautious routine. During daylight hours, Sarah worked her homestead as usual, tending the garden, feeding the chickens, mending fences, always with one eye on the horizon, watching for approaching riders. Maheo spent most of his time indoors, his leg healing, but still not strong enough for extended movement. He practiced his English diligently, absorbing new words with remarkable speed, and helped with simple tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind engaged. At night, they would sit by the hearth as Sarah read aloud from her small collection of books. Though Maheo couldn't understand all the words, he listened intently, occasionally asking questions about phrases that confused him. These quiet evenings had become precious to Sarah, a reminder of what family might feel like, something she'd convinced herself she would never experience again. But as she stoked the morning fire and set water to boil, Sarah knew they're fragile. Peace couldn't last. Major Davis had increased patrols as promised. Twice in the past 2 days, soldiers had ridden past her property, their eyes lingering on her cabin with undisguised suspicion. And somewhere beyond the rolling hills, Black Kettle was searching for his son. The collision of these forces was inevitable. The only question was when it would come, and whether Sarah and Maheo would be caught in the crossfire. A soft rustling from the bed announced Maheo's awakening. The boy sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes with small fists. In just 4 days, he looked remarkably different from the fevered, wounded child she'd found on her doorstep. The hollowness in his cheeks had filled out with regular meals, and his eyes had lost their hunted look. "Good morning," Sarah said, setting a bowl of porridge on the table. "Hungry?" Maheo nodded eagerly, sliding from the bed and testing his weight on his injured leg. He could walk now, though with a pronounced limp that echoed Sarah's own uneven gait. They made an odd pair, she thought with unexpected fondness, both marked by their own histories of pain. As they ate breakfast, Sarah explained her plans for the day. "I need to go to town," she said, speaking slowly to ensure he understood. "For supplies, you stay here." She pointed firmly to the cabin floor. "Hide if soldiers come." Maheo's expression darkened. "Dangerous," he said, one of the new words he'd learned. "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but necessary. We need food, medicine for your leg." The boy studied her face with that uncanny perceptiveness that still occasionally startled her. Finally he nodded, resigned but clearly unhappy with the arrangement. "I come back," Sarah assured him, touching her chest, then pointing to the cabin. "Promise." After breakfast, she helped Maheo rehearse their emergency plan once more. If he heard riders approaching, he would use the tunnel to access the dugout, staying hidden until Sarah gave the all-clear signal. They had prepared a small pack with essential supplies that remained in the dugout at all times, just in case a quick escape became necessary. Sarah dressed in her best dress, a faded blue cotton with minimal mending that she reserved for town visits, and tied her hair back neatly, covering her scar as best she could with a carefully arranged lock of hair. The grooming rituals felt oddly significant today, a kind of armor against the scrutiny she knew awaited her in Riverton. "Be careful," she instructed Maheo one final time, touching his shoulder gently. "Stay quiet." The boy nodded solemnly, then surprised her by reaching up to touch her scarred cheek. "Sarah brave," he said with quiet certainty. The simple declaration caught her off guard, emotion rising unexpectedly in her throat. Sarah swallowed hard and managed a small smile. "We both." "Ah," she replied. Then, before she could change her mind, she left the cabin, securing the door behind her. The ride to town was tense, each bend in the trail bringing the possibility of encountering army patrols. Sarah kept her horse to a steady pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, nothing in her manner to suggest anything out of the ordinary. By mid-morning, the steeple of Riverton's small church came into view, and with it the cluster of buildings that constituted the frontier settlement. Riverton had grown over the past year, the promise of the railroad bringing new businesses and settlers. A hotel now stood at the town's edge, and the general store had expanded to include a second floor where the owner and his family lived. Despite these changes, the essential character of the place remained unchanged, suspicious of outsiders, bound by gossip, and dominated by the uneasy relationship between the townspeople and the nearby army post. Sarah tied her horse at the hitching post outside Hammond's general store, taking a deep breath before pushing open the door. The familiar bell jangled, announcing her arrival to the handful of customers browsing the narrow aisles. Conversation paused momentarily as heads turned in her direction, then resumed in lower tones, the usual response to her presence. Mr. Hammond himself stood behind the counter, his spectacles perched low on his nose as he tallied a column of figures in his ledger. He glanced up at Sarah's approach, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with a nod. "What can I help you with today?" Sarah produced a small list, keeping her voice steady and matter-of-fact. Just the usual supplies, Mr. Hammond, and some extra bandages if you have them. Managed to cut myself rather badly on some fence wire. Hammond's eyebrow rose slightly at the request for bandages, but he made no comment as he began gathering the items on her list. Sarah browsed the store while he worked, aware of the whispers that followed her movement between shelves. Mrs. Patterson stood near the fabric counter with two other women, their conversation faltering whenever Sarah drew near. As Hammond wrapped her purchases in brown paper, the store door opened again, admitting James Cooper. The blacksmith's massive frame filled the doorway momentarily before he stepped inside, nodding briefly to the other customers. His gaze found Sarah's across the store, and he made his way directly to her, ignoring the curious stares their interaction attracted. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, removing his hat. "Good to see you in town." "Mr. Cooper," Sarah acknowledged, noting the streaks of soot on his forearms from his morning's work. "I hope you're well." "Can't complain." Cooper shifted slightly, positioning himself so that his broad back shielded their conversation from the rest of the store. In a lower voice, he added, "Was planning to ride out to your place tomorrow. Thought we might discuss that fence repair we talked about." Sarah understood the coded message immediately. Cooper was offering help, just as he had promised. "That would be most appreciated," she replied carefully. "Perhaps early afternoon?" Cooper nodded, his expression giving nothing away to potential observers. "Early afternoon it is." He glanced at the wrapped packages on the counter. "Those look heavy. Perhaps I could assist you with loading them." Before Sarah could respond, the store door flew open again, this time revealing Major Davis and two of his officers. The Major paused just inside the entrance, his cold gaze sweeping the store before settling on Sarah and Cooper with unmistakable interest. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Cooper," Davis said, approaching them with measured steps. "What a fortunate coincidence. I was hoping to speak with both of you." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate, but kept her expression composed. "Major Davis," she acknowledged. "What brings the army to Hammond's today? Surely not shopping for calico." A tight smile crossed Davis's face at her attempted levity. "Indeed not. We're here on official business." He turned slightly, addressing the store at large. "There's been an incident at the Wilkins homestead, 8 miles west of town." A murmur ran through the gathered customers. The Wilkins family was well known. Thomas Wilkins had been among the first settlers in the area, his farm one of the most successful operations in the county. "What kind of incident?" Hammond asked, pushing his spectacles higher on his nose. Davis's jaw tightened. "A raid. Cheyenne warriors. Wilkins and his oldest boy were killed. The rest of the family managed to escape to a neighbor's property. The shock that rippled through the store was palpable." Sarah felt Cooper shift slightly beside her, his posture tensing. "When did this happen?" Cooper asked, his deep voice unusually terse. "Last night," Davis replied. "We believe it was a small war party, possibly the same group we've been tracking since the storm." His gaze fixed on Sarah, eyes cold and assessing. "The same group is believed to be missing a young boy." Sarah met his stare without flinching, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "That's terrible news about the Wilkins family," she said quietly. "They were good people." "Yes, they were," Davis agreed, still watching her intently. "Which is why I'm implementing new security measures effective immediately. A sundown curfew for all outlying properties, regular army escorts for anyone traveling beyond town limits, and mandatory inspections of all homesteads within 20 miles. The implications were clear. Sarah's cabin would be searched thoroughly. This time, Maheo would be discovered unless she found a way to move him beforehand. "Sounds like martial law, Major," Cooper observed, his tone neutral, but his meaning unmistakable. Davis turned his attention to the blacksmith. "It sounds like protection, Mr. Cooper, unless you have some objection to the army safeguarding civilian lives." The tension between the two men was electric. Sarah subtly shifted her weight, drawing Davis's focus back to her. "When will these inspections begin?" she asked, deliberately keeping her voice calm and cooperative. "Teams will depart at first light tomorrow," Davis replied. "Your property is on the eastern route, Mrs. Blackwood. You can expect visitors by mid-morning." The timeline was worse than Sarah had feared. Less than 24 hours to determine what to do with Maheo, and with the increased military presence, any attempt to move him would be exponentially more dangerous. "I'll be sure to have coffee ready," she said with forced lightness. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I should start back before the weather turns." Davis nodded, though his eyes remained suspicious. "Mr. Cooper, I believe you mentioned assisting Mrs. Blackwood with her packages. That's very neighborly of you. In fact, given the circumstances, perhaps you should escort her all the way home. For her safety, of course." The suggestion, or rather command, hung in the air between them. Cooper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded. "I'd be happy to once I've finished my business in town." "Excellent," Davis said with a cold smile. "Mrs. Blackwood, until tomorrow then." As the Major returned to his offices, Cooper leaned closer to Sarah, his voice barely audible. "Meet me at the edge of town in 30 minutes. We need to talk." Sarah nodded slightly, gathered her purchases, and left the store with as much dignity as she could muster. Outside, the threatening sky had darkened further, the air heavy with imminent rain. As she secured her packages to her saddle, she couldn't help but feel the weight of Davis's suspicion following her, as tangible as the storm clouds overhead. True to his word, Cooper was waiting at the crossroads where the main street gave way to the eastern trail. He sat astride his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding that seemed barely adequate to support his large frame. When he saw Sarah approach, he nudged his mount forward to meet her. "We can talk as we ride," he said without preamble. "But not on the main trail. There's a route through Miller's Creek that's less traveled." Sarah followed Cooper's lead as he turned off the established path onto a narrow track that wound through a stand of cottonwoods. Once they were well away from town and any potential observers, Cooper slowed his horse to ride alongside her. "Davis knows," he said flatly. "Or at least, he strongly suspects. That business about the Wilkins raid was a trap. He was watching." "Your reaction?" Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the gusting wind. "The raid was a lie?" "No, the raid happened." Cooper's expression darkened. "But it wasn't Cheyenne, at least not the way he described it." "What do you mean?" Cooper was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I have connections, people who move between the white and Indian worlds. They say Wilkins and some other men ambushed a small group of Cheyenne 2 days ago, hunters, not warriors, killed 3 of them and wounded others. Last night's attack was retaliation." The information settled like lead in Sarah's stomach. If Cooper was right, the situation was far more volatile than she had imagined. "And the boy, Maheo? What do your connections say about him?" Cooper's head snapped around, surprise evident in his expression. "So you do have him." Sarah realized her mistake too late. She had confirmed Cooper's suspicions by using Maheo's name. For a tense moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves on the damp earth and the distant rumble of thunder. Finally, Sarah sighed. Decision made. "Yes, he came to my cabin during the storm, wounded. I've been caring for him." Cooper nodded slowly. "And you know who he is?" "Black Kettle's son," Sarah confirmed. "Major Davis made that clear enough, though not intentionally." "Black Kettle has been searching for him since the storm separated them," Cooper said. "The hunting party Wilkins attacked was part of that search. The chief has gathered warriors from several bands. They're combing the territory." Sarah processed this information, its implications spinning out in her mind. If Davis searches my cabin tomorrow, he'll find the boy, take him as leverage against Black Kettle, and likely arrest you for treason," Cooper finished grimly. "The army's been looking for a way to force the Cheyenne onto the reservation lands. Having the chief's son would give them a considerable advantage." "I need to get Maheo away before dawn," Sarah said, her mind already racing through the limited options, but with patrols everywhere. Cooper was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the growing intensity of the wind through the trees. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, as if he was weighing each word. "There's a place, a trading post run by a half-Cheyenne man named Thomas Running Fox. It's about 15 miles north, near the fork in the river. He might be able to get word to Black Kettle." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest for the first time since leaving town. "You trust this man?" "With my life," Cooper replied without hesitation. "In fact, I already have, more than once." The simple statement raised new questions about the blacksmith's past, but Sarah didn't press for details. Instead, she focused on the immediate problem. Even if we could reach the trading post, how would we get Maheo there safely? Davis has men watching all the main trails. "Not all of them," Cooper said. "There's an old trapper's path that follows the creek bed north. It's mostly overgrown now, but passable if you know the way. We could leave after midnight, when the patrols change shifts. There's a brief window when the eastern section is relatively unguarded." The plan was risky. A night journey through difficult terrain, with a wounded child, guided only by Cooper's knowledge of forgotten trails. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. Yet the alternative, waiting for Davis and his men to find Maheo in her cabin, was unthinkable. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked, the question that had been lingering since Cooper's first warning. The blacksmith was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I had a wife once. She was a Lakota, Maggie Bird singer. We lived near Fort Laramie. When tensions arose between settlers and the tribes, the army decided mixed marriages were destabilizing influences. They gave us a choice. I could renounce her and stay, or we could leave the territory together." He paused, the muscles in his jaw working. "We chose to leave. We're halfway to Montana territory when a patrol caught up with us, said they had new orders. No Indians allowed to leave the designated areas, regardless of circumstances." Sarah could guess the rest, but remained silent, allowing Cooper to finish his story. "They separated us, sent Maggie to a containment camp, escorted me back to the fort under guard. By the time I managed to get free and find her," his voice trailed off, the conclusion too painful to articulate. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. Cooper nodded once, accepting her sympathy without looking at her. "That was 5 years ago. Since then I've tried to help where I can. Mixed-blood children, Indian women married to white men, anyone caught between worlds like Maggie was." He finally met Sarah's gaze directly. "Like your Maheo is." The simple explanation filled in the gaps of Cooper's reputation, his solitary existence, his obvious distrust of Davis and the army. It also confirmed what Sarah had sensed from their first interaction. James Cooper was a man defined by loss, just as she was. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." As they approached Sarah's homestead, rain finally began to fall, fat drops that quickly became a steady downpour. Cooper pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of her property, scanning the surrounding. "Then scape with practiced vigilance. I'll come back after dark," he said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the rain. "Have the boy ready to travel. Pack light, only essentials." Sarah nodded, already mentally cataloguing what they would need for the journey. "Be careful, Mr. Cooper." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "James," he corrected her. "After all this, I think we've earned first names, don't you, Sarah?" Something unexpected and warm unfurled in her chest at the simple intimacy. "James," she agreed. As she watched him ride away, disappearing into the grey curtain of rain, Sarah was struck by how drastically her world had changed in just 5 days. She had gone from isolated widow to conspirator, from survivor to protector, from alone to something else, something she hadn't dared name yet. The rain followed her to the cabin door, soaking through her dress and plastering her hair to her neck. When she pushed open the door, she found Maheo waiting anxiously, his small face lighting with relief at her return. "Sarah back," he said, limping forward to help her with her packages. Worried, the simple concern in his voice wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. "I'm fine," she assured him, setting her soaked bonnet aside. "But we need to talk, Maheo. Things have changed." As she prepared a simple meal, Sarah explained the situation as clearly as she could, using the limited English Maheo understood, supplemented with gestures and drawings. The boy listened intently, his dark eyes occasionally widening as he grasped the implications of Davis's planned inspection. "Tonight we leave," Sarah concluded, drawing a simple map in the dust on the table. "James will help us. We go to find Thomas Running Fox, who can contact your father." At the mention of his father, Maheo's expression brightened considerably. "Black kettle searching," he confirmed. "Many warriors." "Yes," Sarah nodded, "but we must be very careful. Soldiers everywhere." As evening settled over the cabin, Sarah and Maheo prepared for their midnight departure. They packed only the essentials: food, medicine for Maheo's leg, a change of clothes, Sarah's hunting knife, and the small wooden horse Cooper had carved for the boy. Everything else would remain behind, including most of the treasured mementos in Sarah's wooden box. Only Rebecca's ribbon and David's small Bible found their way into her pack. The rain continued unabated, turning the yard to mud and the creek to a swollen, angry ribbon of churning water. Sarah found herself grateful for the weather. The storm would help conceal their departure and might deter less motivated patrols from thorough searches. As they waited for Cooper's arrival, Sarah sat in her rocking chair with Maheo settled against her side. The boy was quiet, perhaps contemplating the journey ahead or his imminent reunion with his father. Sarah found herself memorizing the moment. The weight of his small body against hers, the rhythmic creak of the chair, the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Whatever happened after tonight, she knew her life would never return to what it had been. "Sarah," Maheo said suddenly, looking up at her with solemn eyes. "Thank you for helping." The simple gratitude pierced through her with unexpected force. Sarah tightened her arm around his shoulders. "You're welcome, Maheo." What she didn't say, couldn't find the words for even in her own mind, was how much the boy had given her in return. In helping him, she had rediscovered parts of herself long buried beneath grief and isolation. Whether or not they succeeded in reuniting Maheo with his father, Sarah knew she could never return to the half-life she had been living before he arrived on her doorstep. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling around the cabin's corners like restless spirits. Sarah rested her cheek against Maheo's hair, listening to the elements rage while they waited for Cooper and the beginning of their perilous journey north. Neither could know that their carefully laid plans would soon be rendered meaningless. That, in just 3 days' time, 80 Cheyenne warriors would materialize from the dawn mist, led by a father whose determination to find his son would change everything. The knock came shortly before midnight, 3 soft raps that barely carried above the storm's howl. Sarah, who had been dozing in the rocking chair with Maheo still, curled against her side, snapped to alertness instantly. She gently roused the boy, pressing a finger to her lips to indicate silence, though the caution was hardly necessary. Maheo had developed an almost uncanny awareness of when to speak and when to remain quiet. "That's James," she whispered, helping Maheo to his feet. "Are you ready?" The boy nodded, his expression solemn but determined. He had dressed in layers as Sarah had instructed, his original buckskin clothing now clean and mended, covered by one of Sarah's shawls for additional warmth against the rain. His injured leg had improved remarkably over the past days, though he still favored it when walking. Sarah retrieved their packs from beside the door, then hesitated, her gaze sweeping across the cabin's interior one last time. This small space had been her refuge for 2 years, not quite a home, but a place where she had rebuilt some semblance of life from the ashes of her past. Leaving it felt significant, as if she were shedding another layer of grief in exchange for something unknown but vital. With a deep breath, she opened the door to find James Cooper on her porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat and his heavy coat gleaming with moisture in the dim lantern light. His expression was tense but resolute as he stepped inside, bringing the storm's scent of wet earth and ozone with him. "The creek's rising faster than I anticipated," he said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move now, if we're going to cross it safely." Sarah nodded, handing him the heavier of the 2 packs. "We're ready." Cooper knelt to Maheo's level, his large frame seeming to fill the small cabin. "Hello, young man," he said gently. "I'm James. I'm going to help you and Sarah reach a friend who can contact your father. Do you understand?" Maheo studied Cooper's face with that intensity that had initially unsettled Sarah, as if the boy could read intentions more clearly than words. After a moment, he nodded. "Help Sarah and Maheo," he repeated. "Find father." Cooper's weathered, her face softened slightly. "That's right." He glanced at Sarah. "Smart boy." "Smarter than most grown men I know," Sarah agreed, helping Maheo into the extra coat she'd altered to fit his smaller frame. "He learns quickly." Outside, the storm had transformed the landscape into something wild and unfamiliar. Rain fell in sheets, reducing visibility to mere yards, while wind bent the cottonwoods along the creek almost double. Cooper had brought 3 horses, his own chestnut gelding, Sarah's familiar mare, and a smaller pony with a gentle eye that he explained was better suited to rough terrain. "The boy will ride with me until we're past the creek," Cooper shouted over the wind, helping Sarah secure their packs. "After that, he can manage on the pony if his leg allows it." Sarah hesitated, looking at Maheo. She had grown accustomed to being responsible for his safety, and the idea of entrusting him to Cooper, despite everything she now knew about the blacksmith's motivations, triggered an unexpected surge of protectiveness. As if sensing her concern, Maheo touched her arm. "It's okay," he said with a confidence beyond his years. "James' friend." The simple declaration settled something in Sarah's chest. She nodded, helping Cooper lift the boy onto his horse before mounting her own. As they set off into the darkness, Sarah took one final glance at the cabin receding behind them, a solitary light in the storm-swept prairie. Whatever happened now, she knew she wouldn't return the same woman who had left. Cooper led them away from the main trail, cutting across the rain-soaked meadow toward a dense line of trees that marked the creek's path. They rode in silence, the storm swallowing any sound, but the horses labored breathing and the occasional crack of wind-whipped branches. Maheo sat before Cooper, his small frame dwarfed by the blacksmith's bulk, but his posture straight and alert despite the punishing conditions. When they reached the creek, Sarah understood Cooper's concern immediately. What had been a modest stream was now a churning torrent, its banks swollen beyond recognition. The crude log bridge that normally provided crossing had partially collapsed, its central section swept away by the current. Cooper reined his horse to a stop at the water's edge, his expression grim as he assessed their options. "There's a ford, about 1/2 mile upstream," he shouted to Sarah. "It'll be dangerous, but I've crossed in worse." Without waiting for her response, he turned his mount north, following the creek's raging path through the increasingly dense vegetation. Sarah followed, keeping close as the terrain grew more challenging. Branches whipped at her face, and her mare struggled for footing on the slick, mud-slicked ground. More than once, she had to duck low to avoid being swept from the saddle by low-hanging limbs. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes of difficult travel, Cooper halted again. Here the creek widened slightly, its flow marginally less violent. Ancient cottonwoods had fallen across portions of the waterway, creating a partial natural bridge that might, with luck and skill, allow them to cross. "I'll go first with the boy," Cooper decided, securing Maheo more firmly before him. "Stay on the rocks where you can see them, and keep moving. If your horse balks, don't force her. Back up and try again." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight for words. The crossing looked terrifyingly precarious, but the alternative, facing Major Davis and his men at dawn, was unthinkable. Cooper urged his horse forward, its hooves slipping slightly on the first rocks before finding purchase. As they entered the main current, the water rose to the animal's chest, forcing it to swim briefly before reaching the tangle of fallen trees. Maheo clung tightly to the saddle horn, his face set in a mask of determination that made him look startlingly like a smaller version of Cooper himself. For one terrible moment, the horse seemed to lose its footing entirely, nearly disappearing. Beneath the churning water, Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But then the animal lunged forward, powerful muscles straining as it pulled itself and its riders onto the relative safety of the opposite bank. Cooper turned immediately, gesturing urgently for Sarah to follow. Drawing a deep breath, she nudged her mare forward. The horse moved reluctantly, sensing the danger ahead, but responding to Sarah's firm guidance. The first few steps into the creek were manageable, the water cold but not yet threatening as it swirled around the mare's legs. Then they hit the main current. The force of it was staggering, pushing sideways against horse and rider with merciless strength. Sarah's mare whinnied in panic, fighting to keep her head above water as the current dragged them downstream. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Sarah felt the terrifying certainty that they would be swept away, that her decision to help Maheo would end here, in the dark waters of a nameless creek swollen by spring storms. "Use the reins," Cooper's voice cut through her rising panic. "Guide her toward the trees." Forcing down her fear, Sarah pulled sharply on the left rein, angling the struggling horse toward the fallen cottonwoods. The mare fought the current, powerful legs churning beneath the water's surface. Then suddenly they were there, the horse's hooves finding purchase on the submerged trunk, muscles bunching as she hauled herself and Sarah up and over the natural bridge. The final push to the opposite bank seemed almost easy in comparison, though Sarah's heart continued to race wildly in her chest. As they emerged onto solid ground, she slid from the saddle on shaking legs, pressing her face briefly against her mare's wet neck in silent gratitude. "You did well," Cooper said, his voice gruff but approving. Maheo, still perched before him, offered a small smile that warmed Sarah despite her soaked clothing and the relentless rain. "The worst is behind us," Cooper continued, helping Maheo down and onto the pony they'd been leading. "From here, we follow the trapper's path north. It's sheltered for most of the way. Old Indian trail that predates the settlers. Army doesn't know about it, or if they do, they consider it impassable." As they resumed their journey, the storm gradually began to subside, the rain softening from violent sheets to a steady drizzle. The eastern horizon remained dark, but Sarah estimated they had several hours before dawn would reveal their escape to Davis and his men. By then, she hoped, they would be well on their way to Thomas Running Fox's trading post. The trail Cooper led them along was indeed ancient, barely more than a suggestion in the landscape, marked occasionally by stacked stones or blazes cut into the trunks of the oldest trees. It wound through dense stands of cottonwood and oak, following ridgelines when possible to avoid the marshy lowlands created by the storm. Though technically more difficult than the main trails, it offered better footing for the horses, and crucially kept them hidden from any patrols that might be abroad despite the weather. Maheo rode his pony with surprising skill, requiring minimal assistance despite his injured leg. Sarah watched him with a mixture of pride and growing unease. Each mile they traveled brought the boy closer to his people and further from the life she had begun to imagine, one where he might somehow remain, with her filling the void left by Rebecca's death. It was a selfish thought, and she pushed it away firmly. Maheo belonged with his father, with his people. Her role was simply to ensure he reached them safely. "You're very quiet," Cooper observed when they paused to rest the horses in a sheltered grove. Dawn was still an hour away, but the rain had stopped entirely, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. Sarah leaned against a tree trunk, massaging her aching knee. "Just thinking." Cooper studied her face in the dim light. "Having second thoughts?" "No," she replied immediately, glancing to where Maheo sat examining a beetle that had crawled onto his hand. "I'm doing what needs to be done. It's just, you'll miss him," Cooper finished simply. Sarah nodded, surprised by his perceptiveness. "Is that foolish? I've known him less than a week." "Some connections don't need time," Cooper said, his voice softening. "Maggie and I knew after 3 days. 7 years wouldn't have made it any stronger or any less real." The casual mention of his wife struck Sarah. Cooper had shared the fact of Maggie's existence and loss, but details had been sparse. That he would offer this small personal revelation felt significant, a token of trust. "What was she like?" Sarah asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. A ghost of a smile crossed Cooper's face. "Stubborn, brilliant. She spoke 5 languages and could outride most men in the territory. Had a laugh that could warm you from 50 paces. He paused, lost in memory. "She used to say that people are rivers, that we carry pieces of everyone we've ever loved in our current, that nothing truly ends, it just changes form." "Do you believe that?" Sarah asked softly. Cooper was quiet for a long moment. "I believe Maheo changed you," he finally said. "And you changed him. Whatever happens next, that remains true." Before Sarah could respond, Maheo approached, the beetle now gone from his hand. "We go soon?" he asked, his English improving, carrying the musical cadence of his native tongue. "Yes," Cooper confirmed, straightening. "We should reach Thomas's place by midday if we keep a steady pace." As they prepared to continue, Sarah found herself watching Cooper with new eyes. The blacksmith had revealed layers she hadn't expected, a bidet philosophical depth, a capacity for poetic expression that belied his rough exterior. She wondered what other surprises might emerge as their journey continued. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they crested a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the territory ahead. In the distance, the Missouri River carved its winding path through the prairie, while closer at hand, patches of forest alternated with open meadows now glistening with leftover raindrops. Cooper pointed to the northeast, where a thin spiral of smoke rose above the trees. "Thomas's trading post," he explained. "Another 4 hours' ride barring trouble." "And will there be trouble?" Sarah asked, the question that had been lingering since they left her cabin. Cooper's expression grew serious. "Davis won't discover your absence until his men reach your homestead, which gives us perhaps a 3-hour head start. Once he realizes you've fled with the boy, he'll mobilize every available man. The question is whether he'll guess our destination." "Running Fox's trading post would be an obvious choice, wouldn't it?" Sarah pressed. "If he's known to have connections with the Cheyenne." Cooper nodded grimly. "Thomas operates in a gray area. Useful to both sides, therefore tolerated. But if Davis believes he's helped spirit away Black Kettle's son, that protection might evaporate quickly." The implications settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. They weren't just risking themselves, but potentially endangering Thomas Running Fox as well. "Perhaps we shouldn't involve him," she suggested. "Maybe there's another way to contact Black Kettle." "We need Thomas," Cooper said firmly, "not just for his connections, but because he can speak directly to the Cheyenne in their own language. Without proper introduction, if you and I were to approach a Cheyenne camp with Maheo—" He didn't need to finish the thought. The current tensions between settlers and tribes made such an encounter potentially deadly, regardless of their good intentions. As the sun rose fully, they descended from the ridge into a broad valley dotted with stands of birch and pine. The trail widened slightly here, suggesting more frequent use, and Sarah found herself growing increasingly vigilant, scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Midway through the valley, Cooper suddenly raised his hand, signaling for them to halt. He tilted his head, listening intently to something Sarah couldn't initially detect. Then she heard it too, the distant thunder of approaching horses, not on their trail, but moving parallel to it, perhaps a quarter-mile to the east. "Off the path," Cooper ordered quietly, guiding his mount into the denser undergrowth. Sarah and Maheo followed, the boy's expression serious as he understood the need for silence without being told. They waited, motionless, as the sounds grew louder. Through gaps in the foliage, Sarah caught glimpses of riders passing, army uniforms, moving, at a brisk trot along the main trail that ran through the eastern section of the valley. Davis had indeed mobilized his men quickly, though whether they were searching specifically for the three fugitives or simply conducting their planned patrols was impossible to determine. Only when the last echoes had faded did Cooper signal it. It was safe to continue, though he led them on a more circuitous route now, keeping to the densest coverage available and avoiding open spaces where they might be spotted from a distance. "They're heading toward Running Foxes," Cooper observed grimly. "We need to reach Thomas before they do." They pushed their tired mounts as hard as they dared, the morning sun climbing higher as they navigated the increasingly difficult terrain. Maheo rode silently, his face set in lines of concentration that made him look older than his years. Occasionally, he would point out details the adults might have missed, a deer path that offered easier passage through a thicket, the subtle signs of water nearby when the horses grew thirsty. By late morning, the landscape began to change subtly. The pristine wilderness gave way to occasional clearings where stumps indicated selective logging. Empty snares hung from branches at strategic intervals, and once they passed a small cabin, likely a trapper's seasonal shelter, its chimney cold and its door securely barred. "We're on Thomas's land now," Cooper explained. "He claims about 5 square miles, trades with trappers, hunters, and the Cheyenne." Sarah was about to ask how much further when a voice called out from the trees ahead, calm but carrying an unmistakable warning. "That's far enough, Cooper. State your business." Cooper reined his horse to a stop, raising his hands slightly to show he carried no weapon. "It's James Cooper from Riverton, Thomas. I've brought friends who need your help." A moment of silence followed, then a figure materialized from between the trees with such sudden clarity that Sarah wondered how she could have missed him before. The man was tall and lean, perhaps in his 40s, with copper skin and black hair streaked with silver. Tied back in a simple braid, he wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt of settler design, the combination emblematic of his mixed heritage. A rifle rested comfortably in the crook of his arm, neither directly threatening nor completely at ease. His dark eyes scanned their small party, widening slightly when they landed on Maheo. The boy had straightened on his pony, staring at Thomas. Running Fox with an expression of cautious hope. "You've brought trouble to my door, blacksmith," Thomas said, though there was no accusation in his tone, merely a statement of fact. "Trouble was already on its way," Cooper replied. "We just got here first." Thomas approached slowly, his gaze never leaving Maheo. He spoke a few words in Cheyenne, his pronunciation fluid and natural. Maheo responded immediately, a torrent of words that Sarah couldn't understand, but recognized as relief and excitement. "Black Kettle's son," Thomas confirmed, glancing at Cooper. "You know what this means?" Cooper nodded grimly. "I know Davis has men heading this way even now. I know the boy needs to be returned to his father before the situation escalates further. And I know you're the only one who can make that happen." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he weighed their request against the obvious risks. Finally he sighed. "Come, we have little time." He led them through the woods, on a path Sarah would never have spotted on her own, eventually emerging into a clearing where a substantial log structure stood on the banks of a small tributary to the Missouri. The trading post was larger than Sarah had expected, a main building flanked by several smaller outbuildings, corrals for horses, and a smokehouse currently in use, judging by the thin grey column rising from its stone chimney. A woman emerged from the main building as they approached, native in appearance but dressed in a simple calico dress of settler design. Her sharp eyes took in the situation immediately, focusing on Maheo with recognition that suggested she, too, knew the significance of Black Kettle's son. "Anna," Thomas addressed her in English, "prepare food for our guests. They've ridden hard, and the boy needs tending." To Cooper he added, "Stable your horses in the back corral, less visible from the main trail." As they dismounted, Sarah's legs nearly buckled beneath her, the long night's ride taking its toll now that they had reached relative safety. Maheo came to her side immediately, his small hand finding hers with a familiarity that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "We made it," she told him, squeezing his fingers gently. "You'll see your father soon." The boy nodded, his expression simultaneously relieved and somehow wistful. "Sarah come too?" he asked, the question catching her off guard. Before she could formulate a response, Thomas approached, his manner brisk but not unkind. "The woman, Anna, will show you where you can rest and clean up. I need to speak with Cooper about arranging contact with Black Kettle." Sarah understood she was being deliberately separated from the decision-making, perhaps because Thomas wasn't certain how much to trust her, or perhaps simply because her exhaustion was evident. Either way, she followed Anna toward the main building, Maheo still holding firmly to her hand. The interior of the trading post was surprisingly well appointed. The main room functioned as a store, with shelves of goods ranging from practical necessities like ammunition and flour to luxury items like mirrors and colored glass beads. Beyond this commercial space, a living area contained sturdy wooden furniture, woven rugs, and a large stone hearth where a pot of something savory bubbled. Anna gestured to a doorway that led to a small but clean side room containing 2 narrow beds. "Rest here," she said, her English accented but clear. "Food, soon." Sarah thanked her, helping Maheo remove his outer layers before checking his injured leg. The wound was healing well, showing no signs of the infection she had initially feared. The boy submitted to her examination with the same patience he had shown throughout their acquaintance, only the slight tension in his shoulders betraying his eagerness to be done with such ministrations. "Almost healed," she told him with a smile. "You're very strong, Maheo." He straightened proudly at the compliment. "Like father," he said. Then, after a moment's consideration, he added, "Like Sarah, too." The simple comparison touched something deep inside her. Sarah brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, allowing herself this small maternal gesture that she had come to treasure over their days together. "We should rest while we can," she suggested. "It's been a long night." Maheo nodded, settling onto one of the beds without argument. His eyes were already heavy-lidded with exhaustion, the strain of their journey catching up to him now that they had reached sanctuary. Sarah sat on the edge of the other bed, intending to remove her boots, but the moment she allowed herself to relax, fatigue washed over her like a physical weight. She lay back, telling herself she would rest for just a moment before checking on Cooper and Thomas's plans. But sleep claimed her almost instantly, pulling her down into darkness, as complete and enveloping as the storm they had left behind. When Sarah woke, golden afternoon light was slanting through the small window, suggesting she had slept for several hours. Maheo's bed was empty, the blanket neatly folded. For a moment panic flared in her chest, but then she heard his distinctive laugh from somewhere outside, followed by a woman's gentle admonition that could only be Anna. Rising stiffly, Sarah straightened her rumpled clothing as best she could and made her way toward the main room. Cooper and Thomas sat at a rough-hewn table, heads bent over what appeared to be a map, their conversation too low for her to catch. They looked up as she entered, Cooper offering a nod of acknowledgement, while Thomas's expression remained carefully neutral. "You've slept well," Cooper observed. "How's the knee?" "Stiff, but manageable," Sarah replied, appreciating his concern but more interested in their plans. "What have you decided?" Thomas folded the map deliberately before answering. "I've sent a runner to Black Kettle's camp. If all goes well, he should receive word by nightfall." "And then?" Sarah pressed. "And then we wait," Thomas said simply. "Black Kettle will come for his son, but on his terms, not ours." The implication was clear. They had done what they could to facilitate Maheo's return to his people, but the manner and timing of that reunion was now beyond their control. Sarah nodded, accepting this reality even as a twinge of premature loss twisted in her chest. "What about Davis and his men?" she asked, changing focus to their more immediate concern. Cooper and Thomas exchanged glances before Cooper answered. "A patrol passed about an hour ago, heading north. They didn't stop, which suggests they aren't specifically looking for us, yet just conducting the increased surveillance Davis promised." "That will change," Thomas added grimly. "Once they discover your empty cabin, they'll connect the pieces quickly enough." The reminder of what awaited them, what awaited her specifically, was sobering. Sarah had violated army orders, helped conceal someone the military considered a valuable bargaining chip, and fled her property in the company of a man Davis already suspected of having tribal sympathies. Even if they successfully reunited Maheo, with Black Kettle, her own future remained precarious at best. As if reading her thoughts, Cooper spoke quietly. "There are options, Sarah. Places beyond Davis's jurisdiction where a person might start fresh." The offer, for that was what it was, however indirectly phrased, hung in the air between them. Before Sarah could formulate a response, the door opened, admitting Anna and Maheo. The boy's face brightened at the sight of Sarah, and he hurried to her side, speaking rapidly in a mixture of English and Cheyenne that suggested he had been learning new words from Anna. "Horses! Many horses!" he explained excitedly, pointing toward the northeast. "Anna, show me with looking glass." Thomas rose immediately, his previous calm replaced by alert tension. "How many?" he asked Anna sharply. "Too many to count clearly," she replied. "A mile, maybe less, moving fast." Cooper was already reaching for his coat. "Davis?" Thomas shook his head. "Not likely. Army patrols don't move that way. Too undisciplined, too direct." Understanding dawned on Cooper's face. "Cheyenne?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "It seems Black Kettle received our message more quickly than anticipated. Or perhaps he was already closer than we realized." He turned to Sarah, his expression grave. "It appears your journey ends here, Mrs. Blackwood. The Cheyenne are coming." For the boy. Sarah felt Maheo's small hand slip into hers, and she tightened her grip instinctively. After nearly a week of protecting him, the sudden imminence of their separation left her momentarily speechless. She had known this moment would come, had worked toward it, in fact, yet now that it was upon them, she found herself unprepared for the emotions it evoked. "How long?" she managed to ask. "Minutes, not hours," Thomas replied, already moving toward the door. "And we must prepare carefully. Black Kettle comes as a father seeking his son, but he also comes as a war chief with warriors at his back. The greeting must be handled with proper protocol." As they stepped onto the trading post's porch, Sarah could see dust rising on the distant horizon, the unmistakable sign of many horses moving at speed. Beside her, Maheo vibrated with barely contained excitement, his eyes fixed on that approaching cloud as if he could already distinguish his father's figure among the riders. Cooper moved to Sarah's side, his voice low. "Whatever happens next, remember this was your choice, a good choice, perhaps the only one that honors what's best for the boy." Sarah nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I know," she said softly, "but knowing doesn't make it easier." Together, they stood watching as the dust cloud drew steadily closer, bringing with it the force that would forever change the course of all their lives. The 7 days that had begun with a wounded child on Sarah's doorstep were coming full circle, but what none of them could predict was how the next chapter would unfold when 80 Cheyenne warriors materialized from the afternoon sun, led by a father whose determination would reshape destinies in ways none of them could foresee. The dust cloud on the horizon transformed into distinct shapes, riders moving with disciplined precision across the open prairie toward the trading post. What had first appeared as a formless mass now revealed itself as 80 Cheyenne warriors, their faces painted in traditional patterns of red and black, eagle feathers and wolf pelts adorning their leaders. Their approach was neither hurried nor cautious, but measured and deliberate, a show of strength tempered by ceremony. At their center rode a figure whose presence commanded immediate attention. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking Black Kettle. The chief sat taller than those who flanked him, his horse a magnificent painted stallion that pranced sideways occasionally, as if sharing its rider's barely contained energy. A full headdress of eagle feathers cascaded down his back, and across his chest he wore a breastplate of polished bone and turquoise that caught the afternoon sunlight with each movement. "Father!" Maheo's voice broke with emotion as he took an instinctive step forward. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, holding him back until Thomas gave the signal that it was safe to approach. "Wait," Thomas cautioned, his tone quiet but firm. "There are protocols to observe. This is not just a father coming for his son. This is a chief arriving with warriors in a time of heightened tensions." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom. In his words, though, her heart ached for the boy's obvious eagerness to reunite with his father. Maheo remained still beneath her touch, but she could feel the tremors of anticipation running through his small frame. Thomas stepped forward as the riders halted at a respectful distance from the trading post. He raised his hand in greeting, then began to speak in fluent Cheyenne. A formal welcome, Sarah guessed, though she couldn't understand the words. After completing what seemed to be a traditional greeting, Thomas motioned for Maheo to come forward. The boy looked up at Sarah, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and something that might have been apprehension. She managed a smile, squeezing his hand once before releasing him. "Go on," she whispered. "Your father is waiting." Maheo straightened his shoulders and walked forward with as much dignity as his still healing leg would allow. The change in his bearing was immediate and striking. Gone was the vulnerable child who had huddled on Sarah's porch during the storm, replaced by a young prince returning to his rightful place. His steps were measured, his chin lifted, his eyes fixed on the imposing figure at the center of the mounted warriors. A ripple of movement passed through the Cheyenne as they recognized the chief's son. Black Kettle himself remained outwardly composed, though Sarah thought she detected a slight shifting of his weight, as if it took considerable restraint not to dismount immediately and rush to embrace his child. Maheo stopped beside Thomas, who spoke again in Cheyenne, presumably explaining the circumstances of the boy's recovery. Then, with ceremonial gravity, Thomas stepped aside, leaving Maheo alone in the space between the trading post and the mounted warriors. For one breathless moment, no one moved. Then Black Kettle swung down from his horse in a fluid motion that belied his years and strode forward. He was taller than Sarah had expected, his face weathered by sun and wind, but still handsome, with high cheekbones and eyes that held both fierceness and profound intelligence. He stopped a few paces from his son, looking down at Maheo with an expression that combined assessment with barely concealed emotion. Maheo stood perfectly still, waiting. Then Black Kettle spoke, a single word that needed no translation, filled with all the relief and love of a father who had feared his child was lost forever. Maheo! The formality dissolved as Maheo rushed forward into his father's arms. Black Kettle knelt, gathering his son against his chest in an embrace that transcended cultural differences and political tensions. The warriors behind him remained, impassive, maintaining their vigilant watch, but the profound emotion of the reunion was unmistakable. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and quickly blinked them away. This was what she had worked toward, what she had risked her safety and her future to achieve. Seeing Maheo in his father's arms confirmed the rightness of her choices, even as it drove home the reality that her time with the boy was ending. After a long moment, Black Kettle released his son, keeping one hand on his shoulder as he straightened to his full height. His gaze swept over the small group on the trading post porch, assessing each face with keen attention. When his eyes met Sarah's, she felt a jolt of recognition. Maheo had his father's direct, penetrating stare. Thomas stepped forward again, speaking in Cheyenne while gesturing toward Sarah and Cooper. Black Kettle listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, the chief nodded once, then spoke in carefully measured English. "My son says you saved his life," he addressed Sarah directly, "that you tended his wounds and hid him from soldiers who would have used him against our people." Sarah found her voice, despite the sudden dryness in her throat. "He needed help. Any decent person would have done the same." A ghost of a smile flickered across Black Kettle's stern features. "We both know that is not true. Many would have surrendered him to the bluecoats for reward or favor." He studied her face with renewed interest, his gaze lingering briefly on her scar. "You have known suffering." It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. "Yes. And still, you chose compassion over safety." Black Kettle glanced at Cooper, then back to Sarah. "My people have a saying. The true measure of a warrior is not how many enemies they have killed, but how many lives they have protected." He placed his free hand over his heart, a gesture Sarah understood to be one of profound respect. "By this measure you are a great warrior, Sarah Blackwood." The unexpected acknowledgement left Sarah momentarily speechless. She had acted out of instinct, not courage, or so she had told herself. To have her choices recognized as acts of valor by a chief whose authority and wisdom were respected by both his people and many white leaders was both humbling and strangely validating. "Thank you," she finally managed, "but Maheo made it easy to help him. He's extraordinary." Black Kettle's expression softened slightly as he looked down at his son. "Yes, he carries his mother's spirit." Something like grief flickered briefly in his eyes before being carefully contained again. He turned to Thomas. "We cannot linger here. The army searches for my son and for those who helped him escape." "Davis and his men passed north earlier today," Thomas confirmed, "but they'll return once they discover Mrs. Blackwood's empty cabin." "Then we must be far from here by nightfall," Black Kettle decided. He looked at Maheo, speaking briefly in Cheyenne. The boy nodded, then turned towards Sarah with an expression that nearly broke her heart. Resignation mingled with a child's simple sorrow at parting from someone who had shown him kindness. "Sarah," Maheo said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "I go with father now." Sarah knelt to bring herself level with the boy who had so unexpectedly transformed her life. "Yes," she said softly, "that's as it should be. You belong with your people, Maheo." The boy reached out, touching her scarred cheek with gentle fingers, an echo of their first real connection days ago. "Thank you for helping, for teaching words, for—" he hesitated, searching for the right expression. "For not being afraid of me." Sarah caught his small hand in hers, fighting to maintain her composure. "And thank you, Maheo, for reminding me there are things worth fighting for." She smiled despite the tightness in her throat. "You're going to be a great leader someday, like your father." Maheo's chest swelled with pride at the comparison, but his eyes remained solemn. "We'll remember you," he promised. "Always." Then, with a child's impulsiveness that contrasted with his previous formality, he threw his arms around her neck in a fierce embrace. Sarah held him close for one precious moment, memorizing the feel of his small body against hers, the scent of his hair, the sound of his breathing. Then gently she released him and stood. "Go with your father," she said quietly. "Be safe, Maheo." The boy nodded, then turned back to Black Kettle, who had watched the exchange with an expression Sarah couldn't quite decipher. The chief placed his hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him toward the waiting warriors. One of them brought forward a smaller horse, helping Maheo mount with careful efficiency. Black Kettle turned back to Sarah, Cooper, and Thomas. "The army will not cease hunting for my son," he stated flatly. "Nor will they forgive those who prevented them from using him as leverage against our people." Cooper stepped forward. "We understood the risks when we helped him." Black Kettle nodded. "Even so, I would not leave you to face their anger without protection." He reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something that caught the sunlight with a golden gleam. "This token identifies you as friends of the Cheyenne nation and under my personal protection." He handed the object to Sarah, a medallion of hammered gold suspended on a leather cord, inscribed with symbols she didn't recognize. "Any Cheyenne who sees this will know you as allies," Black Kettle explained. "If you are ever in need, show this token, and my people will help you as you helped my son." Sarah stared at the medallion, understanding the significance of such a gift during these troubled times. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing that no elaborate expression of gratitude could match the straightforward dignity of Black Kettle's gesture. The chief inclined his head, then turned to mount his horse. As he settled into the saddle, he looked once more at Sarah. "There is a place where the great river bends toward the morning sun," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone, "where 3 tall rocks stand like sentinels above the water. My people will camp there until the next full moon. If you find yourself in need of sanctuary from those who would punish you for your compassion, you will be welcome among us." The invitation, for that was what it was, however obliquely phrased, hung in the air between them, unexpected and profound. Sarah nodded, unable to formulate an adequate response to such generosity from a man whose people had suffered so much at the hands of settlers and soldiers. Without further ceremony, Black Kettle turned his horse, raising his hand in a signal that set the entire company of warriors into motion. Maheo, now seated securely on his own mount, twisted to look back. At Sarah one last time, she raised her hand in farewell, maintaining her smile until the boy turned away. The Cheyenne departed as they had arrived, with disciplined precision and silent dignity, leaving only swirling dust and hoofprints to mark their passage. Sarah watched until they were nothing more than a dark line against the horizon, her hand still clutching the medallion Black Kettle had given her. "He offered you sanctuary," Thomas observed quietly, breaking the silence that had fallen over. "The trading post. That is unprecedented." "Indeed," Cooper agreed, his expression thoughtful. "Black Kettle is known for wisdom, not impulsive decisions. He sees something in you, Sarah." Sarah shook her head slightly, still processing the events of the past hour. "He's simply grateful for his son's safe return." "Gratitude would have been expressed with trade goods or horses," Thomas countered. "Offering personal protection and inviting you into their camp, that's something else entirely." Before Sarah could respond, Anna emerged from the trading post, her expression tense. "Riders coming from the south," she reported. "Army uniforms, 5 men, moving fast." The momentary peace shattered as reality reasserted itself with brutal clarity. Davis and his men had discovered Sarah's empty cabin sooner than expected, and they had immediately connected her disappearance with Cooper's absence and the most likely destination for Maheo. "Inside, quickly," Thomas directed, his manner shifting instantly from philosophical to practical. "Cooper, take Sarah to the back storeroom. Anna, prepare to receive our guests." As they hurried to follow his instructions, Cooper caught Sarah's arm. "Davis won't stop searching," he said urgently. "Not for Maheo and not for us. We've directly challenged his authority and prevented him from capturing a valuable hostage." Sarah nodded, the reality of their situation painfully clear. "I know. We need to leave as soon as Davis and his men move on," Cooper continued. "Head west, perhaps toward Montana territory, or—" He hesitated, glancing in the direction the Cheyenne had disappeared. "Or accept Black Kettle's offer," Sarah finished for him, understanding the choice that lay before them. Thomas appeared in the doorway of the storeroom, his expression grim. "Davis is here. He's demanding to know if I've seen either of you or a Cheyenne boy." He studied their faces. "I can delay him, perhaps convince him you've moved on, but you need to decide quickly what you plan to do once he leaves." Cooper looked at Sarah, the question evident in his eyes. She clutched Black Kettle's medallion, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic, in her palm. The decision she made now would determine not just her immediate safety, but the entire course of her future. "I need to think," she said finally. "This isn't just about escaping Davis, it's about what comes after." Thomas nodded. "Stay hidden. I'll return when it's safe." He slipped out, pulling the storeroom door closed behind him. In the dimness, lit only by slivers of light through the wallboards, Sarah and Cooper waited in tense silence. They could hear Thomas's voice as he greeted Davis, the measured tones of a man accustomed to walking the precarious line between worlds. Davis's responses were sharper, demanding, the voice of authority expecting immediate compliance. "I know. They were here, running Fox." Davis's voice grew louder as he apparently entered the trading post. "Tracks don't lie, and there are fresh horse prints leading directly to your door." "Many people visit my establishment, Major," Thomas replied calmly. "Trappers, hunters, travelers passing through. I can't account for every set of tracks." "Don't play games with me," Davis snapped. "You know harboring fugitives is a serious offense, as is aiding hostiles in time of conflict." "I'm aware of the law," Thomas said, his tone remaining even. "Just as I'm aware that no state of war has been officially declared between the United States and the Cheyenne Nation. Black Kettle signed the Treaty of Fort Wise in good faith." "Treaties can be broken," Davis retorted, "especially when savages steal white children or murder settlers." "Careful, Major," Thomas cautioned, a new edge entering his voice. "You're in a trading post that serves both settlers and native peoples. Loose talk of savages might be bad. For business." The conversation continued, Davis growing increasingly frustrated with Thomas's polite but firm refusal to provide the information he sought. Sarah and Cooper remained motionless in the storeroom, scarcely daring to breathe when boots stomped near their hiding place. After what felt like hours, but was likely less than 30 minutes, they heard Davis issue a final warning to Thomas about the consequences of harboring fugitives, followed by the sound of men departing. Still, they waited, knowing that the soldiers might be setting a trap, pretending to leave only to catch anyone who emerged from hiding. When Thomas finally opened the storeroom door, his expression was grave. They've gone for now. But Davis left 2 men watching the trading post from the ridge to the south. They'll report if anyone comes or goes. How long will they maintain the surveillance? Cooper asked. Thomas shrugged. Days, perhaps. Davis is determined to find you both, and more importantly, to locate Black Kettle and Maheo. Sarah stepped out of the storeroom, her mind racing through their limited options. Did they follow the Cheyenne's trail? They noticed it. Thomas. Confirmed, but Davis seems to believe you might still be here, hidden somewhere. He's dividing his forces, some to follow Black Kettle, others to watch this place and continue searching nearby properties. Cooper cursed softly. If they catch up to Black Kettle with only a partial force, there could be bloodshed. The implication hung heavily in the air. Despite Black Kettle's reputation as a peace chief, his warriors would fight fiercely if soldiers threatened their leader or attempted to recapture Maheo. Any such confrontation would only escalate the already dangerous tensions between settlers and the Cheyenne. We need to warn them, Sarah said suddenly, the decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. Black Kettle needs to know Davis is pursuing them. Thomas raised an eyebrow. And how do you propose to do that with soldiers watching my trading post? There must be another way out, Sarah insisted. A path the soldiers don't know about. Thomas and Cooper exchanged glances. There is one route, Thomas admitted reluctantly. A tunnel that leads from the root cellar to the riverbank. Originally built by a previous owner concerned about Indian attacks. Ironic given the current circumstances. Perfect, Sarah declared. We can slip out after dark, find Black Kettle, and warn him about Davis's pursuit. We? Cooper questioned, studying her face carefully. You've decided, then? Sarah met his gaze steadily. I can't go back to my homestead. Davis would arrest me immediately. I can't flee west without resources or protection. She touched the medallion Black Kettle had given her. But I have been offered sanctuary by someone who honors their word and values loyalty above all. Living with the Cheyenne won't be easy, Thomas warned, especially for a white woman. The cultural differences alone. I've lived alone on the frontier for 2 years after losing everything, Sarah interrupted, a new firmness in her voice. I've built shelter with my own hands, hunted my own food, and survived both natural disasters and human cruelty. I can adapt. Cooper's expression softened slightly. I believe you can, he said quietly, but it's not a decision to be made lightly. Sarah glanced at the medallion in her palm, then back to Cooper. What about you? You've risked as much as I have to help Maheo. Davis won't stop hunting you either. A complex emotion crossed Cooper's weathered face, reluctance warring with something that might have been hope. I've lived between worlds before, he said finally, with Maggie. It wasn't always easy, but it was... He paused, searching for the right word. Real. More real than anything I've known since. His meaning was clear enough. Cooper was considering accompanying Sarah to Black Kettle's camp, not just as a temporary measure to escape Davis, but perhaps as a new beginning. Thomas sighed, recognizing the determination in both their faces. I can't say I'm surprised, he admitted, but you should know what you're choosing. Even with Black Kettle's protection, life with the Cheyenne will be precarious. The army is pushing harder each month for all tribes to relocate to reservation lands. Conflict is brewing, despite the chief's efforts to maintain peace. We understand, "The risks," Sarah assured him, "but sometimes the most dangerous path is the only one that leads forward." Thomas nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll help you prepare. You'll need supplies, information about Cheyenne customs, and a few phrases in their language at minimum." He glanced at Cooper. "Your experience with the Lakota will help, but the Cheyenne have their own ways." As night fell over the trading post, Sarah found herself standing at the small window of the room Thomas had provided for her rest, gazing at stars emerging above the eastern horizon. Behind her, a pack containing essential supplies lay ready, clothing better suited to the mobile life of the Cheyenne, dried food for the journey, medicines, and a few small tools Thomas had insisted she would find useful. A soft knock at the doctor announced Anna's presence. The woman entered, carrying a bundle of fabric in muted earth tones, garments of mixed native and settler design that would allow Sarah to blend more easily into Cheyenne daily life while respecting their traditions. "Thomas says you leave soon," Anna observed, placing the clothing on the bed. "Through the tunnel," Sarah nodded. "As soon as the moon rises. The soldiers will be less vigilant then, more focused on staying warm than maintaining perfect surveillance." Anna studied her with thoughtful eyes. "My mother was Cheyenne," she said after a moment. "My father traded with her people before marrying her. I have lived in both worlds." She gestured to the clothing. "These will help you look less foreign, but it is your heart they will truly see." "And will they accept what they see?" Sarah asked quietly, voicing the doubt she had kept contained until now. A slight smile touched Anna's lips. "Black Kettle offered you sanctuary personally. That alone will open many doors. But more than that," she hesitated, then continued with simple directness. "You saved a child at risk to yourself. The Cheyenne consider children sacred, the most precious gift from the Creator. Your actions speak louder than any words could." The reassurance eased something in Sarah's chest, not all her anxiety, but enough to strengthen her resolve. "Thank you, Anna." When the woman had gone, Sarah changed into the new clothing, buckskin leggings beneath a calf-length skirt of sturdy cotton, a simple blouse, and a fringed tunic that provided both warmth and freedom of movement. The garments felt strange after years of settler dresses, but not uncomfortable. Looking at her reflection in the small mirror Anna had left, Sarah barely recognized herself. The changes went beyond clothing. Something in her eyes and the set of her jaw spoke of transformation more profound than mere appearance. "Another knock, firmer this time," announced Cooper. When she opened the door, he too had changed. Buckskin, pants and a leather vest over a cotton shirt, his dark hair freshly tied back with a leather thong. He carried his own pack and what appeared to be additional weapons wrapped in oilcloth. "Thomas says it's time," he informed her, his eyes widening slightly at her transformed appearance. "The guards have settled in for the night, building a small fire that will ruin their night vision." Sarah nodded, gathering her pack and securing Black Kettle's medallion around her neck. "I'm ready." They followed Thomas silently through the darkened trading post to the root cellar beneath the main building. There, concealed behind stacked barrels of preserved foods, a narrow door led to a rough-hewn tunnel barely tall enough for Cooper to navigate without stooping. "Follow this straight to the riverbank," Thomas instructed, lighting a small lantern for them. "About 300 yards. When you emerge, head northeast, keeping the North Star on your left shoulder. Black Kettle's band will be making camp at the 3 standing rocks I mentioned earlier. About 6 hours' ride at a steady pace." He handed Sarah a rolled piece of hide with markings inked onto its surface. "A map should you need it, though Cooper's woodcraft should see you there safely." "Thank you," Sarah said, gripping Thomas's hand briefly, "for everything." The half-Cheyenne trader nodded solemnly. "May Creator watch over your path." The tunnel, was as restrictive as it had appeared, forcing them to move in single file, occasionally ducking to avoid low-hanging roots or protruding stones. The earthen walls pressed close on either side, damp and cool against Sarah's fingers when she steadied herself. Despite the lantern Cooper carried, shadows danced eerily around them, transforming the passage into something from a disturbing dream. When they finally emerged onto the riverbank, Sarah drew in a deep breath of night air, grateful for the open space after the confining tunnel. The moon had risen nearly full, casting silver light across the gentle ripples of the Missouri. In the distance, an owl called, its haunting cry the only sound in the stillness. Cooper extinguished the lantern, allowing their eyes to adjust to the natural illumination. "We'll follow the river for the first mile," he said quietly. "Less chance of leaving obvious tracks for Davis's men to find in the morning." Sarah nodded, falling into step beside him as they moved along the sandy bank, careful to walk below the high-water mark where their footprints would be erased by the river's natural fluctuations. The night was cool, but not uncomfortably so. The late spring air carrying the scent of new growth and flowing water. They traveled in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts about the journey ahead and the life they were leaving behind. Sarah found her mind returning to her cabin, the solitary existence she had built there, both a shelter and a prison in its way. She had survived within those walls, but perhaps survival alone was no longer enough. After an hour of walking, Cooper led them away from the river and into the gently rolling prairie. Here they moved more cautiously, aware that their silhouettes might be visible against the horizon if any of Davis's patrols were abroad. The terrain grew more challenging as they continued northeast, shallow ravines to cross, thickets to navigate, around occasional stands of trees that offered both welcome concealment and potential dangers. "We're making good time," Cooper observed during a brief rest to consult Thomas's map. "The 3 standing rocks should be visible from the next ridge." Sarah nodded, taking a small sip from her water skin. "What do you think we'll find when we reach Black Kettle's camp, beyond the immediate warning about Davis's pursuit?" Cooper considered the question thoughtfully. "People fighting to maintain their way of life in the face of overwhelming pressure," he said finally. "A leader trying to balance tradition with the need for adaptation and survival. And perhaps—" He hesitated, glancing at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps a place where people judged by their actions rather than their origins might find something like belonging. The simple honesty of his assessment touched Sarah deeply. Cooper had experienced both the beauty and the brutality of life between cultures through his relationship with Maggie. That he would consider returning to such a precarious existence spoke volumes about what he had found there, and what he hoped might be possible again. "I hope you're right," she said softly. They continued their journey as the moon traced its arc across the sky. Just as the eastern horizon began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, they crested a final ridge and saw their destination. 3 towering rock formations jutting dramatically from the prairie floor, their weathered surfaces gleaming gold in the early light. At their base, barely visible in the distance, smoke from multiple campfires rose in thin columns against the lightening sky. "We made it," Cooper said, a note of relief in his voice. "Black Kettle's camp." Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken as they began the final descent toward the Cheyenne encampment. This was it, the culmination of choices that had begun with a wounded boy on her doorstep during a storm. Whatever awaited her among Black Kettle's people, she knew with sudden certainty that it represented not just escape from Davis and his men, but a chance to live fully again, to be part of something larger than her solitary grief. As they approached, movement at the camp's perimeter resolved into mounted sentries, warriors tasked with protecting their people during vulnerable Dawn hours. One raised a hand, alerting others to the approaching strangers. Within moments, several riders detached from the main group, moving swiftly to intercept them. Cooper and Sarah stopped, waiting as the Cheyenne warriors drew near. When they were close enough to recognize faces, Sarah felt a surge of relief. At the forefront rode Maheo, his small face alight with joy at the sight of her. And beside him, imposing and regal even in the simple garments he wore for riding, was Black Kettle himself. The chief reined his horse to a stop before them, his expression revealing momentary surprise before settling into something more measured. "Sarah Blackwood," he acknowledged. "James Cooper, you have traveled far in a short time." "We bring warning," Cooper explained without preamble. "Major Davis follows your trail with soldiers. He seeks to recapture Maheo and punish those who helped him escape." Black Kettle's eyes narrowed slightly, but he showed no other reaction to this concerning news. "How many men? How close?" "At least 20, perhaps more," Cooper replied. "They were dividing their forces when we left the trading post, some to follow your trail, others to continue searching the surrounding area." The chief nodded, processing this information with the calm efficiency of a leader, accustomed to threat assessment. "We will adjust our plans accordingly." He studied their faces carefully. "But this warning alone would not bring you to our camp with such haste. You seek sanctuary." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Yes, if your offer still stands." A ghost of a smile touched Black Kettle's stern features. "My word, once given, does not change with the rising sun." He glanced at Maheo, who was practically bouncing with excitement on his pony. "Besides, I believe my son would be most displeased if I rescinded the invitation." At a gesture from his father, Maheo urged his pony forward, stopping directly before Sarah. "You came," he said simply, his smile illuminating his entire face. "I promised I would find you again," Sarah reminded him, her heart lightening at the sight of his obvious happiness. "And here I am." Black Kettle watched their interaction, something thoughtful in his gaze. Then he turned to his warriors, issuing brief instructions in Cheyenne. Most of the group wheeled their horses and rode back toward the main camp, presumably to prepare for the potential pursuit by Davis and his men. "Come," Black Kettle said, motioning for Sarah and Cooper to follow. "My people will want to meet those who protected the chief's son at risk to themselves." His expression grew more solemn. "The path you have chosen will not be easy. There will be those among both my people and yours who disapprove, but courage is honored among the Cheyenne, and you have shown great courage." As they walked the final distance to the camp, Maheo rode beside Sarah, chattering excitedly in a mixture of English and Cheyenne about all he wished to show her. His father's lodge, the horses, the games the children played. His easy acceptance was a balm to Sarah's lingering anxiety about their reception. The rising sun cast long shadows ahead of them as they approached the circle of teepees arranged around the base of the standing rocks. Women tended cooking fires, children chased each other between lodges, and warriors prepared for the day's hunting or scouting. It was a scene of ordinary life, families going about their daily tasks, a community functioning in harmony with itself and its surroundings. Yet as they entered the camp proper, Sarah was acutely aware of curious eyes turning in their direction, conversations pausing as people noticed the white woman and man accompanying their chief. Some expressions showed open suspicion, others mere curiosity, and a few, particularly among those who recognized Maheo riding proudly at Sarah's side, reflected something that might have been cautious acceptance. Black Kettle led them to the center of the camp, where a larger teepee stood decorated with painted symbols of authority and spiritual significance. Here he dismounted, helping Maheo down before turning to address his people in Cheyenne. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she recognized her name and Cooper's when they were spoken, and noted the reaction that rippled through the gathered crowd. Surprise, murmurs of discussion, and finally a sort of collective acknowledgement. When Black Kettle finished speaking, an elderly woman stepped forward, her face deeply lined but her eyes sharp with intelligence. She approached Sarah directly, studying her with unabashed interest before reaching out to touch the medallion that hung around her neck. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded once and spoke a few words to Black Kettle. "My mother welcomes you," Maheo translated proudly. "Says you have a good heart." The simple acceptance from this woman, Black Kettle's mother, apparently a person of significant influence within the tribe, seemed to set a tone for others. While not everyone appeared entirely comfortable with the newcomers, the initial tension eased noticeably. Black Kettle turned to Sarah and Cooper. "You have traveled far and bring important news. Rest now. Eat. Later, we will speak more of Davis and his soldiers, and of your place among us." He gestured to a smaller tepee near his own. "This lodge will be yours while you remain with our people." As the chief moved away to consult with his warriors, Maheo remained at Sarah's side, clearly appointed as their unofficial guide. "Come," he said, taking her hand with the easy familiarity they had established during their days together. "I show you everything." Sarah glanced at Cooper, who nodded his understanding. They would have time later to discuss their situation more thoroughly, to plan for the inevitable confrontation with Davis and his men, to navigate the complex reality of their new existence among the Cheyenne. For now, it was enough to have reached safety, to see Maheo thriving once more among his people, and to stand at the threshold of a life Sarah could never have imagined when she first found a wounded boy on her porch during a storm. As she followed Maheo through the camp, the rising sun at her back and the imposing standing rocks towering above, Sarah felt something unfurl within her chest. Not quite peace, not yet, but its close cousin, possibility. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she had found her way back to purpose, to connection, to the messy, complex beauty of life fully lived. And for now, that was enough. 3 days passed in a rhythm unlike anything Sarah had known before. The Cheyenne. The camp operated with an efficiency that belied outside perceptions of primitive native life. Each person had their role, each task its purpose in sustaining the community. Though language barriers still existed, Sarah found herself welcomed into the women's work circles, where hands demonstrated what words could not yet explain. Black Kettle's mother, whom everyone called Grandmother Spider for her deft weaving skills, had taken a particular interest in Sarah. The elderly woman would correct her attempts at Cheyenne words with patient persistence, rewarding successful pronunciation with approving nods. Through Maheo's eager translations, Sarah learned not just vocabulary, but the values embedded in the language itself, the emphasis on community over individual, the precise terms for relationships to the natural world, the subtle gradations of respect encoded in different forms of address. Cooper, meanwhile, had found his place among the men with surprising ease. His previous experience with Lakota customs provided a foundation, and his skills as a blacksmith proved valuable to warriors whose weapons and tools required maintenance. More than once, Sarah had glimpsed him deep in conversation with Black Kettle himself, their expressions suggesting discussions of considerable significance. The camp had moved once since their arrival, a strategic decision following the scouts' reports of Davis's men searching the area around the 3 standing rocks. The new location was more defensible, nestled in a shallow valley with clear sightlines in all directions and multiple escape routes should they become necessary. Black Kettle was a peace chief by reputation and preference, but he was also a pragmatic leader who understood the realities of their situation. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah emerged from the lodge she had been given to find the camp alive with unusual activity. Warriors prepared their horses and weapons, women packed essential supplies, and children were being gathered into the center of the settlement under the watchful eyes of the eldest members of the tribe. "What's happening?" she asked Maheo, who had appeared at her side with the uncanny timing he often displayed. The boy's expression was solemn but not fearful. "Soldiers coming. Many soldiers." Sarah's heart sank. Despite their precautions, Davis had apparently located the Cheyenne camp. "How close?" "Ridge to west," Maheo replied, pointing toward the horizon where the first light of dawn illuminated. "A distant line of hills. We'll be here when the sun is high." Cooper materialized from between the lodges, his face grim with purpose. "Black Kettle wants to speak with us," he said without preamble. "Davis is making a direct approach with at least 40 men." "40?" Sarah repeated, alarm sharpening her voice. "That's more than just the local patrols." "He's called in reinforcements from Fort Laramie," Cooper confirmed as they made their way toward Black Kettle's lodge. "This has become more than a search for a missing boy or a couple of frontier fugitives. Davis is using it as an excuse to force a confrontation with the Cheyenne." The implications were chilling. Black Kettle was known for his commitment to peaceful coexistence, but even the most peace-minded leader had limits when his people were directly threatened. They found the chief in council with his senior warriors, the atmosphere inside his lodge tense but disciplined. Black Kettle looked up as they entered, gesturing for them to join the circle. Through Maheo and another young man who spoke better English, he explained the situation. "Major Davis approaches with many soldiers," Black Kettle stated, his deep voice calm despite the gravity of his words. "He demands the surrender of my son and of you both." The chief's eyes moved between Sarah and Cooper. "He claims authority to arrest you for crimes against the United States government." "What will?" "You do?" Cooper asked directly. A hint of approval flickered in Black Kettle's expression at the straightforward question. "I have sent my fastest riders to gather our allies from nearby camps. Women, children, and elders prepare to move to safer ground. If fighting cannot be avoided," his face hardened slightly, "but I did not offer you sanctuary only to surrender you at the first sign of trouble." One of the older warriors spoke then, his scarred face reflecting years of conflict. Though Sarah couldn't understand his words, the skepticism in his tone was unmistakable. He gestured toward her and Cooper several times, his expression suggesting he questioned the wisdom of risking the tribe's safety for two white people. When he finished, Black Kettle was silent for a moment before responding. Though he spoke in Cheyenne, the dignity and certainty in his voice transcended language barriers. When he finished, the older warrior nodded reluctantly, apparently accepting if not entirely agreeing with his chief's position. "Stone Wolf believes we should deliver you to the soldiers to protect our people from conflict," Maheo translated quietly. "Father says honor is not something to be set aside when it becomes difficult. He promised protection. He will give it." Sarah felt humbled by Black Kettle's integrity. The chief barely knew her, yet he was prepared to risk confrontation with the U.S. Army rather than break his word. Such steadfastness stood in stark contrast to the many broken promises made to native peoples by government officials. "We appreciate your honor," she said carefully, "but we don't wish to bring danger to your people. Perhaps there's a way to resolve this without risking lives on either side." Cooper nodded his agreement. "Davis wants us specifically. If we were to meet him away from the camp, perhaps with just a small escort—" "No," Black Kettle interrupted firmly. "Davis does not come for two fugitives alone. He comes to demonstrate a power over the Cheyenne, to take my son if possible, to intimidate if not." The chief's expression hardened. "This confrontation was inevitable. Your presence merely provided the excuse." The stark assessment silenced both Sarah and Cooper. They had been viewing the situation through the narrow lens of their own circumstances, but Black Kettle saw the broader pattern. The relentless pressure on native lands, the incremental erosion of tribal sovereignty, the systematic effort to break indigenous resistance to westward expansion. What can we do? Sarah asked finally. Black Kettle studied her face for a moment before responding. Stand with us, he said simply, not as guests seeking protection, but as people who have chosen their side in this conflict. The invitation, or challenge, hung in the air between them. Sarah glanced at Cooper, seeing in his eyes the same recognition that had just clarified in her own mind. This wasn't about finding temporary shelter until Davis lost interest. This was about committing to a future aligned with the Cheyenne, whatever consequences that might bring. I stand with you, she said, meeting Black Kettle's gaze directly. As do I, Cooper affirmed. The chief nodded once, accepting their declaration. Without surprise, then we will face Davis together. The council continued, strategies discussed, and tasks assigned as the camp prepared for the approaching confrontation. Sarah and Cooper were included in these preparations, no longer observers but participants. By the time they emerged from Black Kettle's lodge, the sun had risen fully, casting long shadows across the bustling encampment. Are you afraid? Maheo asked Sarah as they walked among the preparations, his perceptiveness as disconcerting as ever. Sarah considered the question. Honestly, yes, she admitted, but not the way I used to be. The boy tilted his head, waiting for her to explain. I spent years afraid of living, Sarah continued, the realization crystallizing as she spoke. After losing my family, I was so afraid of feeling that kind of pain again that I stopped taking risks, stopped connecting with others. I existed, but I wasn't truly alive. Maheo nodded solemnly, as if he understood perfectly despite his youth. And now I'm afraid of what might happen today, Sarah acknowledged, but not afraid enough to run from it. That's the difference. The boy smiled suddenly, the expression transforming his serious face into something radiant. Sarah brave, he stated with the absolute certainty children sometimes possess. Like Cheyenne woman, the simple comparison warmed something in Sarah's chest. Before she could respond, however, a commotion at the camp's perimeter drew their attention. A rider had arrived, his horse lathered with exertion, bringing news that sent ripples of tension through the gathered Cheyenne. Cooper appeared at Sarah's side, his expression grim. Davis and his men have crossed the creek to the west, he reported. They'll reach the valley entrance within the hour. The women and children? Already moving toward the eastern passes, Cooper confirmed. Black Kettle won't risk them in a potential confrontation. Sarah nodded, relieved that the most vulnerable members of the community would be safe, yet concerned by the implications. If the Cheyenne were evacuating non-combatants, they clearly believed armed conflict was a genuine possibility. What's the plan? She asked. Black Kettle will meet Davis on open ground between here and the western ridge, Cooper explained. He wants us with him, a visible demonstration that we've chosen the Cheyenne willingly and aren't being held against our will. The strategy made sense, though Sarah doubted it would satisfy Davis. The Major had invested too much of his authority in this pursuit to simply accept their defection and retreat gracefully. When do we leave? She asked. Now, Cooper replied, gesturing toward the center of camp, where Black Kettle and 20 warriors were mounting their horses. The chief believes in meeting threats directly, rather than waiting for them to arrive at his doorstep. As they walked toward the gathering, Sarah noticed Maheo standing with his grandmother, the boy's expression a mixture of worry and fierce pride as he watched his father prepare to confront the soldiers. When he saw Sarah looking his way, he lifted his chin in a gesture of encouragement that nearly broke her heart with its bravery. Black Kettle himself sat astride his painted stallion, resplendent in full ceremonial attire, the eagle feather headdress, bone breastplate, and beaded leggings marking his status as paramount chief. He carried no visible weapons, though Sarah had no doubt the warriors flanking him were well armed beneath their blankets and robes. 2 additional horses had been prepared, a chestnut mare for Sarah and a sturdy black gelding for Cooper. As they mounted, Black Kettle addressed them briefly. "We go to meet Davis with dignity," he stated firmly, "not as supplicants but as free people defending our right to determine our own path. If he wishes to speak, we will listen. If he demands surrender, we will refuse. If he threatens force—" The chief left the consequence unstated, but the implication was clear enough. With that, he turned his horse and led the small party out of the camp, moving at a measured pace that conveyed neither aggression nor fear. Sarah and Cooper rode directly behind Black Kettle, while the warriors fanned out in a loose formation that suggested ceremony rather than combat readiness, though Sarah suspected they could shift to defensive positions in an instant if necessary. They rode in silence across the valley floor, the morning sun warm on their backs as they approached the western ridge, where Davis and his men would soon appear. The landscape here was breathtaking. Rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers, the distant mountains sharp against the horizon, the creek, a silvery ribbon winding through the valley's center. Sarah found herself thinking that if this was to be her last day of freedom, at least it would end in a place of natural beauty rather than behind the bars of an army stockade. They halted in a small natural amphitheater formed by gently sloping hills, positioning themselves so that Davis would need to descend toward them, a subtle psychological advantage that Sarah suspected was not accidental on Black Kettle's part. Here they dismounted, the warriors arranging themselves in a semicircle. Behind their chief, with Sarah and Cooper standing at his right hand, they did not wait long. Within half an hour, movement appeared on the western ridge. The glint of sun on rifle barrels and uniform buttons, the dark shapes of many horses moving in formation down the hillside. As the soldiers drew closer, Sarah could make out Davis. At their head, his posture rigid with military precision, his expression set in lines of grim determination. The major halted his men about 50 yards from the Cheyenne position, close enough for conversation but far enough to provide reaction. Time if hostilities erupted. With 2 lieutenants flanking him, Davis dismounted and approached on foot, stopping at a respectful but not deferential distance from Black Kettle. "Chief Black Kettle," Davis acknowledged with a curt nod. "I've come to resolve several matters of concern to the United States government." Black Kettle returned the nod with equal brevity. "Major Davis, you enter Cheyenne territory heavily armed. This does not speak of peaceful intentions." "My intentions depend entirely on your cooperation," Davis replied, his gaze shifting briefly to Sarah and Cooper before returning to the chief. "I have come for the fugitives Sarah Blackwood and James Cooper, who are wanted for harboring an Indian hostile, interfering with military operations, and fleeing lawful arrest." Black Kettle's expression remained impassive. "There are no fugitives here," he stated calmly. "Only guests who have accepted my personal invitation to live among the Cheyenne people." Davis's jaw tightened visibly at this response. "They have violated United States law and must be returned to proper authorities for trial. They stand on Cheyenne land," Black Kettle countered, "beyond your jurisdiction. The Treaty of Fort Wise recognizes our sovereignty within these territories." The reference to the treaty, which the government had already violated in numerous ways, clearly irritated Davis, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Cooper," he addressed them directly, ignoring Black Kettle's statement, "I offer you one opportunity to return voluntarily and face trial under proper legal procedures. If you refuse, I will be forced to take more direct measures." Sarah stepped forward slightly, finding her voice despite the fear that fluttered in her chest. "We have made our choice, Major Davis," she said clearly. "We stand with the Cheyenne." Cooper moved to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "There is nothing for us to return to," he added, "and no justice to be found in your courts for people who have done nothing wrong except help a wounded child." Davis's expression hardened further. "You naively mistake temporary tolerance from these savages for acceptance," he said coldly. "The first time crop yields are poor or game becomes scarce, your scalps will hang from a lodge pole as easily as any other white settlers." The crude attempt to drive a wedge between them and their Cheyenne hosts might have been effective once, but Sarah had seen enough of Black Kettle's people to recognize the lie in Davis's words. She was about to respond when Black Kettle himself spoke, his voice carrying unexpected authority despite its measured tone. "We have accepted Sarah Blackwood and James Cooper as friends of the Cheyenne," the chief stated with quiet dignity. "They have proven their character through their actions. Can you say the same, Major Davis, with your broken promises and armed threats?" The pointed question struck home. Davis flushed, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sidearm before he caught himself. The gesture, however brief, was noted by the Cheyenne warriors, whose postures subtly shifted in response to the perceived threat. For a tense moment, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Sarah could feel the potential for violence humming in the air between the two groups, a spark away from ignition. Then, surprisingly, it was Cooper who broke the tension. "Major," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of reason that drew all eyes to him. "You came for Sarah and me, but this is escalating towards something much larger. Is enforcing a questionable arrest warrant worth risking open conflict with the Cheyenne Nation?" The question, pragmatic rather than confrontational, seemed to penetrate Davis's anger. The major glanced at his men, outnumbered by the Cheyenne warriors visible here and potentially facing even greater opposition if Black Kettle's allies arrived, then back to Cooper. "My duty is to uphold the law," he said stiffly, but with less conviction than before. "And Black Kettle's duty is to protect his people," Cooper replied evenly, "including those he has accepted into his tribe. There is no path forward here that doesn't end in bloodshed, which I don't believe is what either of you truly wants." Black Kettle nodded slightly, acknowledging the wisdom in Cooper's words. "The blacksmith speaks the truth," he said to Davis. "We each have responsibilities to those who depend on us. Must these responsibilities lead to death on both sides?" Davis was silent for a long moment, visibly weighing his options. Sarah could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes, the tactical assessment, the potential political ramifications, the personal consequences of either retreating or forcing a confrontation that might turn into a massacre. Finally, he straightened his shoulders, his decision apparently made. "I will withdraw my men to the fort," he stated, addressing Black Kettle directly. "But this matter is not resolved. I will be reporting to my superiors that the Cheyenne are harboring fugitives from United States justice. And I will inform the Indian agent that Major Davis brought armed soldiers into peaceful Cheyenne territory without provocation." Black Kettle countered calmly. "Let our respective authorities determine the next steps." It was, at best, a temporary truce rather than a resolution. But as Davis turned and walked back to his waiting men, issuing curt orders that soon had the entire detachment withdrawing up the western ridge, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The immediate danger had passed, even if the larger conflict remained unresolved. Black Kettle watched the soldiers depart with an expression that combined relief with weary resignation. When the last blue uniform had disappeared over the ridge, he turned to Sarah and Cooper. "Davis will return," he stated matter-of-factly. "Perhaps not tomorrow or the next day, but eventually. With more men, more demands." "We've brought this trouble to your doorstep," Sarah acknowledged, guilt threading through her relief. "We never intended—" Black Kettle raised a hand, cutting off her apology. "The trouble was already here, long before you arrived," he said with surprising gentleness. "The difference is that now, when it returns, you will face it as Cheyenne, not as outsiders, The simple declaration struck Sarah with unexpected force. Not guests, not fugitives seeking temporary shelter, but Cheyenne, people who belonged to this community, who would share in both its struggles and its joys. As they rode back to the camp, where women and children were already returning from their temporary evacuation, Sarah felt a sense of homecoming, unlike anything she had experienced since the fire that claimed her family. The landscape around her, once foreign and intimidating, now felt welcoming, alive with meaning and connection. The people waiting in the distance, once strangers divided from her by language and culture, now represented community, purpose, future. Maheo rode out to meet them, his face alight with relief when he saw his father returning unharmed. The boy's gaze moved quickly to Sarah, his smile widening when he confirmed she too had returned safely. "You stay now?" he asked as they dismounted at the camp's edge. "For always?" Sarah glanced at Cooper, finding in his weathered face the same certainty she felt in her own heart. Then she looked back to Maheo, the child whose arrival on her doorstep had set this entire journey in motion. "Yes," she said simply, "for always." The sun climbed toward its zenith as they walked into the camp, its warm light illuminating a future Sarah could never have imagined when she first stood on that porch. 7 days earlier, watching 80 mounted warriors materialize from the dawn mist. A future not without challenges, not without dangers, but rich with possibilities she had thought forever lost. A future where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't. Want to pass these up? Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.